We're now in public session. Thank you. So, at the request of Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are switched off completely or turned to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 6 on the agenda is energy efficient housing, and on behalf of the committee I would like to welcome to today's meeting from the Irish Green Building Council Mr Pat Barry and Ms Marianne Jammett, and from Tipperary Energy Agency Mr Paul Kenny and Ms Kate Ruddock. Before we begin, just a quick note on privilege. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Mr Barry to make his opening statement.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to present at today's meeting. The Irish Green Building Council was founded by organisations operating in the construction and property sector to accelerate the transition to a sustainable built environment. We advocate, we educate, but we also develop tools to facilitate this transition. We have, for example, developed the Home Performance Index certification system to improve environmental quality of new homes, the EPD Ireland programme to provide transparent information on the environmental impact of construction products. In 2017, we worked in close cooperation with the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment to develop Ireland's national renovation strategy. We are now working with our members on the implementation of this strategy, which includes working with all the construction institutes to upskill their members for renovation. We are also working on designing a building renovation passport to enable homeowners to plan cost-effective, staged renovation over a number of years. We must get all our homes, both new and existing, to zero carbon by 2050. For existing homes, we need a step change in both the level of activity and the depth of energy efficiency upgrades to transition every home to zero carbon. In the process, we can eliminate fuel poverty and improve people's health and well-being by giving them warm, mould-free homes. This will reduce health expenditure by alleviating illness related to damp and cold. We can also create sustainable construction jobs for the next 30 years in every village and town across the country. We welcome the recent document from the Department of Housing, Bringing Back Homes, a manual for reuse of existing buildings. By focusing on renovating empty homes and accommodation above shops and businesses in the centres of our villages and towns, we can revitalise existing communities while reducing carbon emissions from transport and making the best use of the existing stock. The National Planning Framework proposes to build 500,000 houses over the next 21 years, adding 25% to the existing stock. This represents a great opportunity to regenerate and densify existing towns and cities. The Nearly Zero Energy Standard comes into force this year on the 1st of November for new homes through Part L of the building regulations. But we need to go further. We must move to fossil-free energy systems. We must also consider the wider unregulated carbon impacts of homes, such as water usage, the materials used to build them, and we must ensure that all new homes are well located with walkable access to amenities and public transport. By moving to energy-positive homes, new homes can play a part in decarbonising our electricity. Our Home Performance Index certification gives developers and local authorities a framework for better built, better quality, healthy homes in connected, ecologically enhanced communities. It is not enough to have energy-efficient homes, they must enable low-carbon lifestyles. So we believe that the following actions are needed to ensure all citizens can make low-carbon choices and live in truly sustainable homes and neighbourhoods. Firstly, government must provide long-term certainty that deep energy renovation is and will remain a top priority. This will allow everyone in the industry to invest with confidence in the skills and innovation needed. Secondly, government needs to support the rapid upskilling of the industry so that homeowners can identify which professionals and tradesmen have the expertise to do quality renovation. We must ramp up funding for local authorities to renovate all of their housing stock. And fourthly, we need to make finance available to everyone to renovate their homes, whether through low-interest loans or green mortgages. The Irish Green Building Council has just been provided funding by the European Commission to work on establishing a green mortgage programme in Ireland over the next 2 years. This will enable homeowners to access cheaper finance for renovation and allow home buyers to benefit from reduced interest rates if they buy the greenest new homes on the market. We already have commitments from home builders to provide greener new homes if the banks support them with such a programme. All banks, credit unions and other financial institutions should now be required to play their part and participate in financing the energy transition. I'd like to thank you once again for the invitation today.
Thank you, Mr. Barry. Mr. Kenny, would you like your opening statement?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for asking me to present here today. I have a statement which covers a lot of the stuff that Pat has said, so I'll try and not cover the same topics too much. I think, first of all, the Energy Agency has spent the last 15 years renovating homes with a lot of support from the state to a high energy standard. However, in terms of the renovation challenge, roughly about somewhere between 500 and 1,000 homes are renovated each year to a very high standard with renewables, where we phase out fossil fuels from buildings. This needs to deepen. So we're currently renovating about 30,000 homes a year. The National Development Plan says this needs to go to 45,000, but realistically, we're only shallow retrofitting those 33,000 homes. So maybe 1,000 homes are hitting the target. That needs to get to 45,000 homes a year between now and 2050. That's the scale of the challenge. And that's really important that the committee understand that is actually what we have to do. We have to get to every building and spend 30 to 50,000 euros on each of those buildings. That is huge. That provides a huge opportunity in terms of health, in terms of jobs, in terms of environmental, in terms of fines from Europe, in terms of our moral obligations. But that is the scale of the challenge, and I think the committee should know that that's one of the key parts. So I have a couple of points to make. I think there are new NZEB building regulations that are due to be published in the next couple of weeks. They're very good from an energy efficiency point of view, but they still have the allowance of developers to put in fossil fuel boilers that the state will then have to fund to take out. Now, I suppose 2 or 3 years ago when we looked at it and when the sums were done, it says that the performance of those buildings with the gas boiler, because it's so energy efficient, will be similar enough to a heat pump. But our electricity grid has got more renewable. The 70% target that has been widely accepted both from the Minister and the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action will mean that those numbers are going to be very different. So I think the regulations, while they have taken the last 2 years to come into force, I think they're almost going to be out of date. The European Commission published in 2016 a guidance for NZEB, which the definition is a very energy efficient building with a very significant portion of the energy coming from renewables. We've defined that in Ireland as 20%, a very significant portion. The European Commission has guided that that should be 55%. We're missing an opportunity. It's at no cost to the state, and I think we should revise the regulations that are going to be published next week urgently. We are going backwards in the number of homes that have heat pumps installed, or that have fossil fuel boilers. Even the ones we are retrofitting with fossil fuel boilers, the new build is overtaking that. So to build on that, I suppose that's one of the points on new build. The big challenge, however, is all about retrofit. we've renovated a number of homes with people with severe respiratory illnesses, and I know the state have also got a similar scheme. And we see huge savings and huge health benefits as part of that. So I think we should certainly think about a specific scheme that heavily subsidises people who are in fuel poverty with solid fuel heated homes, particularly in the Midlands and peat burning areas where the environmental emissions from one home could be 20 or 30 tonnes of CO2 and could drop that to 800 kilos or less. And that would obviously have a big impact on the energy transition and in terms of environment and job creation in the Midlands. When it comes to the non-state or non-low-income homes, in order to entice people to renovate their homes, we need to ensure they need to want to renovate their homes, and when someone comes to help them, that they will get a good renovation and sound, impartial advice. I personally believe the state needs to significantly ramp up its involvement in market development. We currently do grants, but we don't really force the training through the marketplace. In Upper Austria, a region the size of Munster, they have cut the CO2 from buildings by 45% in a decade. So that sort of impact is possible, and they will say that that impact is a combination of carbon taxes to push people to say, well, what do I need to do to get rid of this tax? Grants to subsidise and help them, but the specific big difference between there and here is the market development. So they have huge training courses. If you were a plumber, you must become a plumber for installing renewables. You can't just choose that if you wish. You must be able to do the right things. Secondly, homeowners need to be able to afford to do that, which Pat has talked about the potential for green finance. I think in terms of the allocation in the National Development Plan of 4 billion, that's going to support maybe 6, 7, 8% of the houses we need to renovate. It's too small. The state is carrying too much of the burden right now in the deep retrofit programme. We need to have blended finance with grants and advice. There's several models across Europe. Conference after conference you go to, they all talk about what the solutions are. We know what the solutions are. They are a blended loan, grant, a very low-cost loan, grant, and advice from a qualified professional. And I think that's really the most important thing we need to move on to now, is that market development and the blended finance and grants. And really, I suppose there's another one or two kind of key things to say, like the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action has suggested that we have a one-stop shop for renovation, providing advice, retrofit design and procurement, which is what the Energy Agency does. Whether it's that model or another model, one needs to have a professional in renovation. You cannot let that up just to the contractor who turns up on the door. You need to have someone who is advising the homeowner. And that's very important that we build that capacity in Ireland. Just one last small comment in terms of planning permission. The Planning and Development Regulations, the exemptions for renewables published in 2007 and 2008, are very much out of date and are restricting the development of solar PV. One needs to get planning permission to put any solar PV on the roof of a school. You don't need planning permission to put a fossil fuel boiler in that school. You need planning permission for a homeowner to go over a very small amount of solar PV, or a business owner or an industrial unit over a certain amount, over 50 square metres or 7 kilowatts. We need to change that. It's a stroke of a pen. It's a single line in a statutory instrument. And while I know we will be told later today, and it'll be in the all-of-government plan, that we're going to do it, it really is urgent. These are things that we've been calling for years to be changed. And it's such a small little thing that we could just do with the stroke of a pen. It's an SI, a single line on an SI. So please, can we take out some of those costs out of the supply chain and move on? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kenny. Jennifer?
Thank you very much. And I suppose it's great that we need to make awareness for energy efficient stock, and I think that's so important. Can I just ask you about the grants? I want to find out about some of the grants that are out there. I really don't know if the public are really aware of them, and I think that's so important. And can you tell me about the figures and how much funding is drawn down to service these grants, and if there's a lot of cash left over? Because dealing with different people, and you've spoken, General, there about different, particularly new builds, but I would see in our existing stock how can we make it more, I suppose, efficient for cost? Because it is, whether it's local authority housing, whether it's old housing that have been bought, there is a kind of an issue there. So maybe you could give me some of the figures to know, is all the funding being used up? And I think we, and I think local authorities in general, need to put more emphasis on telling people about their entitlements, because people coming to my clinics are sometimes they're not aware of these grants. I know local authority would always have the grants and they would be doing their own stock, and they're actually doing as much stock as they can. But we have older houses that people would have bought out over the years. Getting them the grant is very hard, and then again it's about awareness. So I'm just wondering about the funding and the stock, and about can we do some kind of a bigger campaign. And just, you spoke there about mortgages, you called it the greener homes, kind of like a mortgage, and you said about talking to the banks and the credit union. I think that would be so important, that even with local authority mortgages, and I think a lot of people are taking that road now, if you don't qualify through a bank or a building society, that you go to your local authority. I think the local authority could play a massive input into this, dealing with people. And again, I just feel it goes down to awareness, but I think this is huge going forward, absolutely. And I think it's all of us, through government, through local authorities, it's all of us to play our part. So maybe you might just come back to me on some of those figures. I'm kind of addressing the two of you, so thank you.
I know some officials from SEAI are here in the room, and will be presenting to you. So I'm going to suggest you maybe ask the question on the percentage of money drawn down and all that sort of stuff to them. In terms of the awareness of grants and so on, it's absolutely right that not everyone is aware. There is programs for free upgrades for people in receipt of fuel allowance, and we certainly see them not being very aware out there, I suppose, in the marketplace. If they are more aware and there was more demand, then there may be a request for more funding. I think one of the big issues that I see and I hear all the time is people will have gone and done a renovation in their house and completed a renovation in their house, and whether grants or otherwise, have gone and put in another fossil fuel boiler. And the awareness of the requirements in the professions, so the architects and engineers, is very poor. And as an engineer, and I'm sure Pat can comment as an architect, our professions aren't at the stage they need to be, and I think that's a problem.
It's an issue.
But that goes straight down to the trades, and it goes down to the officials in local authority housing. It goes across the supply chain in Ireland, and climate change is really only getting into the zeitgeist over the last 18 months. But I think we need really robust regulation I would call very strongly for a building regulation that says no more fossil fuels in homes, because we are in a climate emergency. We've adopted that. That means we need to change what we do, and it's not simply a case of saying they're not a very good thing from the state. The state needs to step in and say, actually, you're not allowed to buy that anymore. And that might mean challenges in terms of financing, but really, unless we start to put out those market signals, we're going to still have the same problem. The builders providers would be quite happy to sell, people would be quite happy to make them, but unless we start to really challenge that, and that is not going to happen unless the politicians decide this is not okay. New schools, new public buildings are built currently with fossil fuel boilers across the board, and unless we make a statement, unless you make a statement, to be honest, because the civil servants don't have the ability to say, I'm going to spend more money on capital that restricts them to something else. They need the statement to come from the elected members of Dáil.
Thank you. That's huge, and I think it is up to us as government to make sure that we do change legislation, because going forward, we need to do that, and we need to make awareness. And I think it all boils down to awareness and people not having proper information, and that's something we need to target. And I think going forward, all of us here, even the Climate Change Committee and through housing, which is our area, but all of us together need to work on this, because this is where we're definitely falling down. I really believe that. And thank you.
Do you want me to respond on the green mortgages?
Yes.
There's great opportunity in the local authority mortgages to incentivise developers to build higher quality homes, because at the moment it's you can borrow up to 250 in a rural area and I think 325 in an urban area. But there's no criteria set for what type of house you can borrow. You could buy an F-rated house, or you could buy an A1 rated house, and there's no differential in the quality of home that you're buying. So there's real opportunity to set criteria in there. There's even an opportunity, I know the NTMA released a green bond last year, and green bonds are oversubscribed. There's an opportunity, say, in the construction of public housing. The way green bonds work is exchequer spending is packaged as green, so it's typically investment in decarbonising the grid or in things like flood relief measures. But there's an opportunity, if we went for really ambitious standards of social housing, that could then be be rated as green, and that could be packaged up as part of the green bond for sale internationally.
It's important. Yeah, thank you.
Very much. Deputy O'Brien.
Thank you for the presentations. Maybe a couple of opening comments and then a few questions. I think it's fair to say this committee has probably been behind the curve in terms of addressing and discussing the issues that you're raising with us today. Partly, I suppose, because so much of our focus has been on the acute end of the housing crisis and therefore housing supply and all of that. But it seems absolutely appropriate that at a time when housing supply is increasing, albeit for some of us not fast enough, we actually have this conversation now to ensure that particularly all of the new builds, whether public or private, kind of meet the kind of challenges that you're outlining. So just to say to the Chair, I think this is one of those meetings where it would be really good if we're able to agree a short report for the Minister afterwards, maybe with some very clear recommendations, picking up on some of the points that you make, so it's not just a hearing, but something kind of comes out of it. My own view is I have been concerned for a while, and this is in no way a criticism of SEAI, and I'll discuss it with them later, but the way in which a lot of those grants are constructed make them very difficult for a lot of homeowners to access. Those that do, they're really, really good and they have huge benefits. And I really welcome the kind of argument around blended finance and loan finance, because it just seems to me, given the scale of the retrofit challenge in the private housing sector, that's the only way that that's going to be really addressed. I'd go further and I'd have a mixture of loans and timeline deadlines. I mean, I think the only way at this stage of the emergency that we can ensure people do take up, for example, loans, is you set deadlines by which date they have to be done. So rather than trying to incentivise behaviour, you say it's a little bit like when I was in the north and planning guidelines were changed for disability access to buildings. What the British government did very clearly was said, you have this number of years, here are the financial supports in place, but your buildings will no longer be compliant by such and such a date if you don't meet it. And I think it's that kind of easier access to finance, but clear timeline deadlines is what we need in this area. I do have some concerns, and while I know it's not your own area, I'm hoping you might be able to make some comments that will inform us when we have the department in afterwards. One of the big concerns I have as well, a significant amount of money has gone into upgrading local authority stock in terms of retrofits. The BER rating it's taking that stock up to is still very low. It's a B rating rather than the higher. Have you any thoughts on that and ideas in terms of the development of it? I have to say I'm really glad you mentioned the issue of the gas boilers. It just seems to me absolutely crackers that we're about to have a new set of regulations in place, and 50 to 60% of all new builds will have gas boilers. It makes no sense, and I don't accept what some of the construction industry arguments say, that it would be prohibitively expensive, particularly when you look at the savings that would be made for the homeowner in terms of the reduced energy cost. I actually think they get a much better deal. But I'm also hearing from people who are purchasing new homes, particularly homes that have a mixed PV and gas, or PV and electricity pump, that when they're buying the homes, a lot of the stuff hasn't been installed properly, or hasn't been installed for them to get the maximum use. Or when they buy the home, there's an additional cost in actually getting a lot of the technology actively working in the house. And again, is that something you're coming across? Could you comment on that and give us your thoughts? And again, I think that emphasises the strong point you're making in terms of the need for additional training. I'm amazed, and I didn't know until recently, the planning restrictions. I mean, given that the Minister has been willing, in some instances in very good ways, in other instances in my view in very bad ways, to rapidly push through SIs that have very significant planning implications, whether it's on building heights or building sizes, or what we're getting at the moment with the short-term lettings, which I welcome. This seems to me just to be a no-brainer. Is there a reason why it hasn't been done? I mean, is there any resistance to it or opposition to it? Because certainly that seems to be one of the very simple recommendations we could make. And just in terms of the one-stop shops, do you have an idea about how that could be best rolled out? So, for example, could we have one in every local authority in the country, or what do you think would work? And particularly from the experience in Tipperary, where there's been a lot of good work, can you advise us on some of that? Two final things, again to go back to finance. I wonder if we could consider making the case that Home Building Finance Ireland, for example, could try and work in some of the things that you've just said in terms of the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan Scheme, where if loans are being issued from HBFI, that it should have some of those same kind of differentiating criteria, because that would be a very significant development as well. And if you have thoughts about how Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan, the criteria could be developed, maybe you share your thoughts with us on that. And then finally, just on the building materials, could you talk more about it? I mean, obviously concrete is the big one. There are a lot of interesting new building technologies out there, although again we get into the same problem of are our construction professionals and workers sufficiently trained? But what kinds of building materials do you think we should be moving towards? What kind of building materials do you think we need to be leaving behind to do some of the things that you've spoken about?
I'll go to yourself first, Mr. Barry.
Well, I start with the last thing first. Just on the building materials, under the NZEB now, the actual construction products that go into buildings will account for more, in the year of construction, they will account for more carbon than the entire operation of the building over 60 years, and that's in the year that we build them. Globally, the embodied carbon of constructing building now accounts for 11% of the total carbon globally, and concrete alone is 8%. So we now have to start regulating. Well, I think we need to move towards regulation of embodied carbon, because it's so significant now at the levels of efficiency that we are.
Can I just ask, when you say embodied carbon, that's the carbon that's a consequence of the production of the materials in the process?
Yeah, and the process of transporting it and constructing the building, but the most of it is in the process of manufacturing the material. So what we are trying to do is get manufacturers to produce data. So we have an EPD program that gets them to produce the data, so that then architects, and because it's not just about the material itself, it's about the quantities of material used. So it's about optimization of the structure and using less, as well as using lower carbon materials. And again, there's a great opportunity for the rural economy of producing lower carbon materials like fibre insulations, hemp insulations. You know, within France, they've developed a farmers cooperative have developed a whole business around hemp insulations. We don't produce any of that in Ireland. We could be producing wood fibre insulations from our forests that would be lower carbon. We need to move to timber frame and CLT instead of concrete.
CLT being?
Sorry, that's cross-laminated timber, where you can build massive beams. You can build up to 22 stories in solid timber. On the finance, I think there's potential to set criteria, because it's not just about the energy efficiency of the homes themselves. The biggest cost for a home buyer is the transport that they need to access the home. So if they need to own a car, that's adding, and the total monthly mortgage cost, that's adding up to could add up to €1,000 a month to the monthly cost, and that's not taken into account in a mortgage. That if the people live where they can walk and cycle, then they don't need a car. And it's not taken into account in a mortgage. So there's great potential there to set criteria around all of those factors: embodied carbon, transport, and energy efficiency.
Okay, I'll try and take the questions from the beginning. I think the first question about difficult to access in terms of grants, and the question around one-stop shops, almost I feel has an element that can be blended. So some of the SEI grants are extremely easy to access from a grant point of view, but it's the who do I get to do it? How do I know they'll do a good job? Is there competence and capacity in the market? We have a very unregulated plumbing, plumbing and insulation, construction industry. So it's quite, that's the challenge. So like we ran a scheme a number of years ago funded by SEI, and it was really trying to push this idea of grouped access to grants, where we had a single figure for 3-bedroom semi-Ds, and all the homeowner needed to do was sign on it. We organised everything else. I definitely know people rang us up and said the only reason I'm doing this is because it's really, really easy and I couldn't be bothered otherwise. It was the same grant, but it's just the facility of streamlining to make it very easy. So that's what the Energy Agency has aimed to do. So I suppose we're a social enterprise. We're governed by the local authority. We were set up by the local authority. And we act on behalf of the local authority in Tipperary and surrounding counties. I think it's a model that would work very well. It's a model that works well across Europe. It has been under severe pressure. There was a lot more energy agencies back in the early noughties. The financial crisis meant that a lot of those disappeared. Our business model is under pressure to deliver, and that's a very, very good thing, because that means we have to be lean, that means we have to deliver, that means kilowatt hours are important. The energy efficiency obligation scheme from energy suppliers is part of the funding model of how we provide that. So having something that is internally in a local authority without the stick of having to deliver, I think would be not a good idea. It's pretty well known across Europe of what works in terms of one-stop shops. I think our model has been very effective in Tipperary. Part of that is because of the support of the local authority. Part of it is because we've had some brilliant staff over the years. But I think it works. You might need a little bit of funding to get it up and running, or maybe a program-based funding where people get energy advice, and that's a paid for service. You get X hundred euros per energy advice. We wrote a proposal for the department a number of months ago, and it was submitted into the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. I'm happy to send that around as well. It wouldn't be very expensive to do, but would really open up. And this is what I mean by market development. I think the state is focused too heavily on grants without spending more money on training. And ultimately, the reason the training isn't working is not because of the Department of Energy or SEAI. There is a different department. They've not been engaged. We have no apprenticeships in plumbing. There's just nothing happening in the training and capacity building, and it's very hard to hold the Department of Housing or the Department of Energy responsible for something that is a different department's responsibility. And that dovetails very neatly into the question of market capacity and new homes. The biggest concern of the Department of Housing, and Sean will allude to this, is if we go and put in 30,000 heat pumps next year and nobody has a clue what they're doing, we have a serious problem, and I share his concern. This has been a concern that we've all talked about for the last 7 years. We've done nothing about it. It's still a concern because we've done nothing about it. So what we need to do is we need to fix that problem urgently and move that problem along so that we're not here in 3 years' time saying, well, we can't mandate it because we don't have the capacity in the market to deliver it. We've just completed a research project with Limerick Institute of Technology and ESB Networks and Electric Ireland on optimisation of homes for air source heat pumps, and it's not very hard to do, but you need to do it. There's a couple of steps. It needs to be designed properly and installed properly. It's not rocket science, right? All of Swedish heat now is either district heating or heat pumps. They phased out fossil fuel boilers. It's across the board in a lot of other parts, Japan, Australia. There's loads of places that don't use fossil fuel boilers for domestic heat. It's a question of the right skills, the right regulation, the right CPD for plumbers and so on. And really the last question in terms of finance, it's very widely known. Like, we have a scheme for SMEs, which is the Department of Finance, EIB de-risking the money run through the pillar banks. It's exactly the same model. It's been rolled out in a number of European countries. The discussions have been had with various different officials across the board. Everyone is aware of what needs to be done. It's a question of just delivering that. And like the state can borrow at a fraction of the cost. Like if you go to a homeowner and say you're going to say, you know, a 10-year payback, and you add 8 or 9% interest rate on that loan, it removes the payback. It becomes very costly. If that's 2%, it's a totally different game. So the opportunity is very clear. The steps that are needed, while they're hard work, they're not rocket science. We've overcome much more challenging things as a state, and I think these things need to be put in place and need to be put in place urgently. And the people in the background know all of these solutions, but ultimately there is not enough people in the Department of Housing and the Department of Energy to get all of these things done. So unless we staff the civil servants, unless we have the capacity in the civil service to deliver the changes needed, we're going to be sitting here going, we have a long list of things to do, but we don't have anyone to actually deliver these. So if you ask me what the biggest barrier in Ireland has been for the last 5 years, it's lack of civil servants. And you can see it, it's not just this department, it's not just the Department of Energy, it's across the board. That's what we need to do. We need to put the capacity in there so they can get through those programmes.
Thanks.
Mr. Barry, you want to come back in on something there, did you?
Yeah, I think you also asked a question, I think, touching on minimum standards for rental accommodation. Around minimum BER. We're currently doing a consultation on how a minimum BER might be implemented, and I suppose the key, we're doing a lot of consultation with the industry, and I suppose the key thing that comes back is it needs to be signalled well in advance, and it needs to be supported. You need the same grant support for landlords, because quite often they're smaller landlords with a couple of properties, and they don't have the wherewithal to renovate them as well. So you're bringing in a minimum BER. You also need to bring in the same grants and support structures for them.
Do you want to come back in on anything?
Just two things. In terms of the detail of the model as it operates in Tipperary, maybe you could just, notwithstanding the fact that you're going to give us the document, just for the record, just give us a little bit about how the operation works, what the costs are involved, what the origins of it are. Because again, if that model works, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could maybe just consider that that's something that should be rolled out, you know, over a period of years in local authorities. I did ask a question just in terms of social housing and the retrofitting, and again, it might be something that neither of you are in a position to comment on, but if you have thoughts on that, I'd be interested to know. And I didn't mention the private rental sector, but I should have done, so you prompted me to ask one further question. Like, we have 340,000 rental tenancies across the state in terms of registered, and you're right, the vast majority of those are one-off, accidental or semi-professional landlords. I mean, obviously, they can already write off any capital improvements, albeit only at whatever it is, the 8.5% or 12% annually. Is there an argument to say that they should be able to fast track that, or is it that you blend a different kind of loan product alongside a clear target date where they have to come up to a certain standard? Because one of the fears many of us have, and I don't want to open up the debate around carbon tax, but even if you're in favour of it, if you think it incentivises, the one group of people who it'll do nothing for is the renter, because of course they'll be paying the tax, but that they don't have any ability to control the retrofitting of the property. So do we need something specific for the private rental sector, particularly given, okay, it's decreasing in numbers at the moment, but it's likely to start to increase again at some point in the future?
Yeah, just quickly, in terms of social housing, the Department of Housing, Planning, Local Government, who I'm sure will allude to this question later on, brought, I suppose, a two-step, so fabric first and then heating, which I think is broadly the right thing to do. The problem is, if the primary appliance is, for a lot of local authorities, particularly in rural areas, is solid fuel, very, very inefficient stove, where you can use cheap fuel like €5 a go or whatever it is. Whatever you multiply, when you multiply the efficiency by 60%, it results in a very poor BER. So you get the fabric right. The next phase will be put in a very efficient heating system. I think that's broadly a very sensible thing. I think get the whole stock up from a fabric point of view and ventilation point of view, and then address the heating. So I think, I certainly know from my own local authority, they're moving now into phase 2, and I think the schemes are now available for phase 2 for heating. So I broadly think that the scope and scale and type and approach that the department has taken is right. We're all frustrated with the lack of pace, but that's an exchequer question, and it's beyond my pay grade, for want of a better word. Okay, so in terms of the one-stop shop model, to put it on the record, the agency was one of 16 set up, originally co-funded from Europe in the late 90s in Ireland. There's essentially 3 that now provide those services. The idea was that you would provide services to both your local authority and the community at large, be it SMEs, community buildings and housing. There really is only 2 of us left that provide the suite of services. So what I suppose our business model is, we have a cost. The cost is staff. I think 78% of our running cost is the engineers and staff. We will use, we have, I suppose, a certain portion of our business is commercial. So we have commercial clients that pay commercial rates. We charge them a profit. We use that profit then to do public good work, including policy discussions such as today and my own salary. We then have programmes like the SEAI-funded Better Energy Communities or the Deep Retrofit, which we use a combination of funding from SEAI, from the homeowner and from the Energy Efficiency Obligation Scheme to fund that work. And we have some support from the European Investment Bank for 3 years to try and scale up that renovation. So we would have more or less triple the amount of carbon savings and energy savings over the last 3 years with that EIB support. And it roughly works out as probably somewhere between 25% and 30% of the cost of providing the service. So hopefully by the time the EIB support is gone, we'll be more efficient and able to do that. So essentially, you know, our board is governed. Our board is made up of the local authority, of experts, and is governed to achieve a service. It's a non-profit service delivery in terms of overall. We charge a profit on commercial and a non-profit on community and charities and homes and so on.
And your annual operating costs?
So we have approximately 24 full-time staff and another 5 or 6 people who work with us part-time. Our turnover, let's say in the last fiscal year, will have been about 2.2 million. We would provide a lot of services outside of Tipperary because there isn't anyone else providing some of those services. Most of the costs are just staff, and we have to compete with the market for staff. So we pay engineers the going rate for engineers. I suppose what we do, we would have maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of our staff would be technically focused, very much on building renovations and consultancy. We would have a communications and events part, so we would run particular events. We run an energy and agriculture event with the IFA and Chagas to try and help that sector along. We do a lot of work with SEI and a number of their different programs. We work for them in terms of their public sector program and so on. And our communication staff would work on trying to get the energy transition more widely known. So we do marketing campaigns and case studies and videos and events and go around to, you know, public centres in Tipperary and so on, and various different things to try and increase the amount of knowledge of the energy transition. It has been very successful, but it has been very hard, and some state support for that would be wonderful. But I think if the state support is done incorrectly, I think you will get people sitting on the fence and not delivering. So I think whatever state support should be based on delivering an effective service. Whatever state support, if there is state support, should be based on kilowatt hours and CO2 tonnes, and very much focused on supporting the market, but be lean and effective in doing that.
Mr. Kenny? Or sorry, Mr. Barry.
You asked on the BER. We agree we need a combination of the carrot and stick. So you need the stick, you need the minimum BER to signal that landlords will be required to bring rental accommodation to a minimum standard, and then you need a couple of mechanisms specifically designed for the landlord that helps them get across the line, because quite often they own 1 or 2 properties and they have the same issues with accessing finance as an ordinary homeowner. So you need a combination of measures to make it happen.
Thanks, Chair.
Fergus?
Thank you, Chairperson. I have the chair meeting fairly soon, so I'll have to go fairly soon, so I'll miss some of the commentary, but I just want to welcome our guest today and say it's very interesting and very enlightening. I suppose you're obviously really, you're at the cutting edge of what we should be doing, and what you are doing isn't what you're saying isn't being done everywhere. So I think that's the first point, is that the energy, the knowledge base, the enthusiasm, the professionalism you clearly have. How do we replicate that universally across our country in a way, as you point out, that is focused on outcomes and not on anything else? In other words, how do we replicate you in Loudmead or whatever? So you said there were two of you, I think, still in existence. Who were the other group? That's just one question. The second one is that I know, I'm just speaking for myself, right? After the winter, you get your bills that come in and say, God, I better do something about that. And actually, most of us don't do anything about it, because we know the bill is going to reduce for February, March, April, but you're thinking again. So one thing I think might be useful, I didn't see it in my bill from my energy supplier, but there should be maybe a reference to a hotline, or to, how do you communicate? Who do I ring? What do I do? And I think somewhere around February, I looked at the local council I got a list of BER people you could go to who were actually registered, that were qualified to do the work. But I just think part of the problem is, people are thinking about energy bills, particularly in the winter, and I think to encourage them to ring or to hotline or whatever, I think even on the bills that they get might be helpful, who they would ring, whether it's SEI or whatever. Or maybe even that notice is there and I haven't seen it. But I'm just saying that that's what we need to do. The second point is, I understand, I don't know where it's at, but the ESB at one stage they were talking about a scheme that whatever your energy costs are, they would keep them at a constant, but by retrofitting energy improvements in your home, that they would fund that. I don't know where that is now, that scheme. In other words, if you were to change some of your energy uses in terms of reducing your carbon footprint, that they would put it in for you and your bill wouldn't get any dearer. In other words, the maximum exposure you would have. And I think that was an important point. The other point is that the people who need fuel most are older people, and I suppose very young children as well, but older people often live in the least energy efficient homes, and I know local authorities do a lot of excellent work, but is there more what more could we do, or should we be doing? Should we target older people in a special way? I might have said this at a previous meeting, but in the 1970s in Drogheda we had a scheme where the local authority in the wisdom decided, well, there weren't going to be any more. The fossil fuels at that time were so dear that they wouldn't put any chimneys in, but instead they installed, it was electricity was very cheap at that time. And then immediately after that, I know it was fossil fuel energy, we had the oil crisis, and people couldn't heat their homes, and they actually had to reinstall chimneys in all the homes so that people could use, again, fossil fuels, which at that time were cheaper than the ESB. So I just think whatever you're going to do, you have to make sure that there'll be infinite availability of the energy resource, and that it won't be subject, to the market forces. That happened in the 70s. That was the trend then. And I agree that we have to reduce our carbon footprint. So the last point I want to make is it's just what you say and what I hear you saying effectively is that people might be listening, but they're not acting on what you're saying, or there isn't a communication pathway that you have access to key decision makers across departments, and you mentioned, I think, 3 different departments there. So could we make a recommendation here that to the Minister or to the Ministers that would, make sure that your agenda is their agenda? Because, as you say, there's no point in coming back in 3 years' time and to say, well, we should have done this, that and the other, and we didn't do it. So there would be the main points I would have.
Thanks, Fergus. Mr. Kenny?
Yeah, I guess you asked a question, who are the others? There's 3 energy agencies that are independent. There's Codema, which is the City of Dublin Energy Management Agency, but they only really provide services for the local authority. Now, the scale of the Dublin local authorities are such that they need a professional service almost entirely for themselves. For the energy agency type model in Tipperary to be replicated in Dublin, it would be quite a large unit, I would suggest. The other one is the 3 Counties Energy Agency, which covers Carlow, Kilkenny and Wexford. And they would have a very similar model to us, and their 2 senior staff would have formerly worked with us in Tipperary, so that they would do some great work there. You asked a question in terms of pay-as-you-save. The ESB don't do a pay-as-you-save product. Part of that idea of a blended loan, finance and grant is that your energy bills would more or less match the savings, or sorry, your loan repayments would match the savings. However, they won't always, and we need to be very frank, unless we have very high energy costs, we have very low fossil fuel costs, so unless carbon tax comes in, you won't pay as you save effectively. And the Green Deal in the UK failed spectacularly, and that was one of the rules, that it must have been that. And it's very hard to do that with very low fossil fuel prices, where a lot of the costs of the provision of the fossil fuels are subsidised, never mind taxed. So in terms of, you mentioned a question around electric heating and the oil crisis. I'm just going to give you an anecdote. We renovated 3 houses in an ex-social housing estate. There were 3 private houses. Collectively, the 3 houses spent €7,100 on heat the previous year, mixture of oil, solid fuel, LPG, storage heaters. So there were 3 very different heating systems that had changed over time. The 3 houses are heated for under €1,000 this year, funded under SEI's deep retrofit scheme. It wasn't a cheap renovation, but those 3 houses have no mould from having loads of mould and loads of health issues, to being very warm, very dry and very cheap to heat. And the cost of heating those houses is much less than the fuel allowance, so essentially they're free. That is how we will remove carbon emissions and fuel poverty, through insulation and heat pumps, not through subsidy. About €45,000 each.
How much?
45,000 per unit.
Per unit.
Yeah.
So who funded that then?
Government.
The government, right. And
the government funded 95% and the homeowner funded the other 5%.
Right.
It's expensive. This is this is going to cost 50 billion. It's not a simple thing to do. But that 50 billion, you know, if you take one of those homeowners who is elderly that doesn't have to go to hospital for a week.
Oh no, it makes a huge difference.
It's a massive difference.
Yeah, because people, older people absolutely need.
We have seen homeowners with COPD that had 7 or 8 stints in hospital over a 3-year period have no more. We've seen kids with really bad asthma symptoms that no longer have any asthma symptoms. I'm not saying asthma is cured, but there's no symptoms.
Yeah.
So in the last question you asked, you said people are listening but not acting. I think the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action put together a very substantial report with all of the recommendations that we're talking about, with training and capacity building and so on. And, you know, we're all very aware of the all-government plan on climate action being drafted, and I presume being all of government, it will include some of those departments and will include skills. I would be very hopeful that that will be included. It's not something that the Department of Climate Action don't know. I would say they're very frustrated that the other departments aren't doing what is needed, and you can ask them that question yourselves. They may not answer, but I'm very hopeful that that will deliver a significant change. We'll see.
Just a point about the ESB were proposing, I think, about 3 years ago to have a pay-as-you-save scheme. So I presume if they put it into resources that would you get a quick return on. What you seem to say there is, notwithstanding what you do, the alternative is so cheap that you still do it.
Yeah.
So really what you're saying is bring on the carbon taxes and force to change.
Like, I know it's been debated.
I'm just trying to understand.
Carbon tax has been debated a lot.
Yeah.
It is my opinion, being at the coalface of renovation in Ireland and probably retrofitting more houses than anyone else, our organisation is, if we do not have a carbon tax, we will not achieve anything near the scale we need. Absolutely clear. But if we have only a carbon tax and we don't do the market development stuff, we won't get any. You need grants, you need carbon tax, but you really, really need to focus on skills, training, the one-stop shops, the service provisions. Like Upper Austria focuses a third of their budget on making sure that when you want to go and renovate your house, instead of having a list of BR assessors and none of them answer the phone, you have a professional service at the end that goes, no problem, I'll be out to you on Tuesday, I'll spec your renovation and we'll get the contractor out the following week to start. That's what you need. You need to move into a situation where it is really easy for people to do it, and they just start paying €300 a month or €500 a month for 5 or 10 years, whatever the cost, and it becomes really easy. If you deliver that, you need much less carbon tax and you need much less grants to achieve the same. But realistically, with the scale of the challenge to go from 1,000 to 45,000, we need all three, and we need a lot of all of them.
Right.
And that's really a very important thing to say, that we need to change from this completely hands-off, market-led to the state needs to intervene. But it is much cheaper to intervene in training and capacity building than it is to help to hope that the market does that on their own.
I just one other point is just when you're talking about carbon taxes and in terms of home heating and so on, I think the older people are the people who need it most, but probably have least income to pay, or the impact has to be significantly reduced. So does that make sense to you that whatever we do, we should be protecting older people, from the impact of the tax on their capacity to live and to heat their homes, and with that, there's a special grant system for.
I think that there's been exhaustive studies done on carbon tax by the Department of Finance to make it socially just. I think we should use those fantastic pieces of work that have been done, notwithstanding the fact that you will only ever protect someone from fuel poverty effectively with insulation. You won't do it with grants. We can't afford to keep giving people subsidies for fossil fuel, because that's what we're doing as a state.
So what you're saying is define it by insulation as opposed to anything else.
Yeah.
Okay.
I suppose the Department of Climate Action does have a pilot scheme to specifically target people with health and respiratory issues to try and give them, to improve the quality of their homes, so that because within the expectation that they will reduce the costs, healthcare costs. But I suppose it's also worth saying that you can walk into a garage any day of the week and buy a car with 0% finance. You can walk out the same day with a car that costs approximately the same as doing an entire deep energy renovation, and you can do that in an afternoon. It's a lot more complicated for a homeowner to do that with a renovation, so we have to get to the same level of simplicity in delivering a renovation, a deep energy renovation, as is currently offered by the car dealerships.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Mr. Barry. Eamon.
So I was late coming in, and I'm going to have to also head off shortly to prepare for another event. But this is hugely important in the delivery of our climate just transition. We've declared a climate emergency last week. It's not just symbolic, it has to be real. And I think the first real reflection of it could and should be the changing of the building regulations, or the publishing, as I understand it, which are imminent, to say that we are going to put in no more fossil fuel heating systems. That's minimum. That's first things first. Let's get that. And if the department believes that there's some reason why that isn't possible, well, I think they should, before they finalise it, they should come back in, or if the government believes that, if the government's going to sign off on that, they have to come and explain to the Oireachtas, I think, in advance why. Because I think it is possible, and it is achievable, and it is prudent, and it is going to save our citizens having the cost of taking them out again in 10, 15 years' time. I'm sorry, I missed some of the presentations, Pat Barry or Marion, but I caught most of Paul's. One question I have in relation to that, and you're right, I think one of the game changers that's occurring in that is the 70% renewables target we've now set for 2030, which I think we can and will achieve, and that changed the underlying maths around. Does it also, I was interested, Paul, you mentioned there that you're working with the ESB on the integration of heat pumps and so on. Are we yet with the capability? It's not just that you have a 70% renewables, so you can, that makes the figures different on the low carbon effectiveness of heat pumps. But are we also in the sense that if we have a large body of heat pumps, it may help us deliver the 70% target? How close are we to providing that balancing, flexible demand management capability in the use of heat pumps? Are we doing it yet? Are other people doing it? In some ways, it's a win-win, because the 70% figure will help justify the heat pumps, but the presence of the heat pumps will also help us to achieve the 70% figure. It's one of the big flexible demand management flexibilities, and I'm just interested to hear, are there any specific examples of that back up the case for that? And secondly, with regard to the deep retrofit, my understanding is you're right, the scale of the challenge, people don't realise how big this task is. The National Development Plan, as I recall, as you said, I think it intimated we would have 45,000 houses a year by 2021 being deep retrofit. I'm going on memory here, but in my recollection, the development plan said that would be up to a B1 plus or B rating, which is in effect for most of those houses is a deep retrofit. And as you say, I mean, you say 1,000. My understanding, I asked the department, I think a number of months ago, what the figures for last year were. Was there something like 220 deep retrofits, maybe through the grant scheme? So it's not 1,000 up to 4,000, 45,000. It's even several hundred, rather. But still, the scale of the jump is beyond compare. And we don't have the workers. Anyone working in this space now, you ask them, they just can't get the contractors. So the ICTU at a conference there 2 weeks ago recognising that we need something like 18,000 workers, and we have to do that, as you say, with an apprenticeship scheme. This is a career. This is a 30, 40-year project. So when I'm going into it, we know we've got a work stream for 30 years ahead of them. So we have to start by employing thousands and tens of thousands of young Irish people to work in this industry. I was just slightly concerned, Paul, with your, not concerned, but I questioned when you said the likely support mechanism for this project, this deep retrofitting, would be still blended grants and loans. And I'm uncertain as to whether in the private property sector, we will actually have the budget to do the grant bit. Because I'll tell you why. Because we also have, and I agree with you fully that provision in the NDP, 4 billion was it, is not going to be sufficient. If you think what we have to do, and I think our first priority should be to deep retrofit all social housing, to, as we introduce carbon tax, to make sure that social justice is brought to the fore, then we should really target any state funding, in my mind, at social housing stock. And we have maybe some better control over that in terms of, you know, obviously as the state being owner, we can maybe order it in a slightly more certain way. So that social housing stock alone would eat all that budget straight away, not leaving huge money for grants. But then if you add to that, we had in the Climate Action Committee, when we were discussing this, we had the OPW and other relevant departments in asking about the public sector building stock and where we are to meeting the, is it 33% energy efficiency target for 2020, and we're nowhere near meeting it. And we haven't touched the building stock of public buildings, in truth. We've done a lot of behavioural stuff, but what the OPW and others said is we haven't touched most of the buildings. So as well as having this social housing project we have to do, we also have public buildings. Every school, every hospital, every Garda station, every department building. And that again has to be direct state funded. That's where, you know, so with those two big, huge and most important projects, I'm not so certain that there's going to be the budget available in this €50 billion deep retrofit project we have. And even if we did, there's a social justice issue where we're seeing so many instances at the moment. The broadband plan is one, social housing is another, where the state is providing huge benefit to the private owner from public funding, and at a certain point you say, I prefer to spend it on social housing. And I just say that as to when you say it's going to be blended grant, I think we should be nervous about that. And I know there's a debate that has to be had in the next 5 months in terms of what we do in the introduction of a carbon pricing, carbon tax system. And one of the suggestions coming from other parties is that we should grant aid. It seems to me what they're saying is grant aid private property in this space. Even if we did that, we're only looking at a maximum income of, as it ramps up in 10 years' time, to maybe about £1.5 billion a year. So it's not that huge a purse. But there's a social justice issue where I'd say, is that the best use of public funding? So my instinct is the majority of the private retrofit is going to have to be regulating the rental market, as Eoin Ó Broin has suggested, so that they have a kind of, over a time period, 5-10 period, if you're going to be renting, you're going to have to do the retrofit. And in private-owned property, residential, we're going to have to provide the really solid, low-cost loans that you mentioned. And if we can get that finance packaging correct, we may not need the grant. If you can get the right loan facility in place, then the costs, the returns cover the cost of the loan, and you don't need the grant. That's where we should, in my mind, be aiming to go to. Now, and I agree with what your assessment was. What I heard you say is that the cornerstone of this is going to be similar to what's starting in other European countries, is probably 1/4 of the loan being covered by our strategic investment bank, with EIB capital covering the risk capital for the first quarter of the loan. And as you say, pillar banks, or indeed it could be other institutions, providing the remaining finance. That seems to be the structure that probably is most likely. But the question I have for you is, and I don't know how much work is done on this or whether you've looked at it, I agree fully with that sort of approach, but how do we get that loan down to 2% with pillar banks involved, is the question I have, in terms of they don't make money on 2%. Now, maybe some of our grant support maybe is in some sort of loan financing grant support, I don't know, but just the maths of it. And how many years loan are you looking at for that? What are we talking about? Are we talking 10-year? Are we talking 7-year? Are we talking 15-year? I mean, my instinct is the longer the loan and the more you can attach it to the property. So maybe if someone sells the property, the loan continues on to the next owner. It might be the way to do it. But this is the most important. I mean, I think you're right. The first most important thing is to get all the workers. But the second most important thing is to get that loan financing package correct, or maybe to try out different loan financing packages in the next year or two, and then when we find one that really does work with the public. And then the last question, just to have on that, and sorry I've been narrow focused on that one issue, I have another instinct that in the private sector particularly, we should maybe strategically target rural Ireland houses first, because for a variety of reasons. Firstly, if we're going to get workers back home to do this, maybe from Australia or elsewhere, it might be easier to come back home and get a worker to live in Kerry rather than Killiney, in terms of just the cost of rent in Dublin. Secondly, there's a real issue again on the whole carbon tax issue, the justice issue around rural Ireland. We should proactively work against that, or kind of mitigate that by targeting rural Ireland. And also, I have a sense from the work you've done in Tipperary, it may be easier for us to go in and deep retrofit one-off houses in the country than it is to do terraced houses. And even in one-off houses in the country, it's much easier. You know you can put a heat pump in, you know you can put electric vehicle charging point in, which I think we should be doing all at the one time. So we're going in with everything. We're putting solar panels on the roof, heat pump in, some sort of battery storage maybe, insulation is first and foremost. So just in some ways, I think it might be easier to aggregate a large number of rural houses in that sort of scheme. You don't have the difficulties you run into my constituency. Putting electric charging points is not as easy today as it would be in rural Ireland. And maybe there might be some difficulties with heat, although I think less and less. I think heat pump technology is improving. But I just do think there's a strategic decision we might make in terms of saying, yeah, we really do target rural housing. So I'm interested to know your thoughts on that. So there are the three questions I have. Sorry for going on for so long. Are we getting already the flexibility around heat pumps to help us deliver the renewables, to make the case for getting rid of all oil and gas-fired burners? How do we get a 2% loan? And do you think we should target rural first? social housing and rural first.
That's great. Good few really interesting questions there. I suppose the first one in terms of heat and flexible demand, we've just finished a research project with ESB Networks, Electric Ireland. We've tried a tariff to I suppose at a fixed level to say, can we move the demand? And it was universal. We can once you get a reasonable level of retrofit in the house, you can put that heat in over whichever hour of the day that the grid should request. So we've definitely moved it all out of the peak periods. However, you will still need to introduce heat at least every day, or at least twice a day, for want of a better word. So how close are we to it? Like, it's a question of digitisation of the energy system, and the heat pumps can do the work. The communications infrastructure isn't quite there, and I'm not getting into broadband today, but that is very much part of it, because if we need to dump load quickly to protect a transformer, we need to have robust communication, if that's what we're doing with the flexible demand. One really interesting thing is at -5 degrees, the average load was 2.8 kilowatts across the 20 homes we surveyed. The design load of the grid is 2.5. So it's very little issue with the grid from an effective demand point of view with heat pumps. Very different case if you put an extra 7 kilowatts of an EV outside that house. Yeah. So from that point of view, we're not there in terms of can we roll that out tomorrow, but there's no reason why we couldn't, in terms of there's no technology that's a barrier. It's a question of designing how we do it and coming up with the payment mechanisms, or the standards, or if you install a heat pump, you must do this, that, and the other. Some German cantons have required a smart grid enabled heat pump that can be dumped if required. And that's the sort of thing I would suggest, rather than the market payment mechanism, that it has to be done that way. In terms of your question around deep retrofit and 500 to 1,000, the deep retrofit programme would have had 220. There are other homes that are renovated in other SEI schemes, Better Energy Communities, but also non-grant aided stuff. So the data that I looked at had about 500 homes that were a B2 with a heat pump that were registered for grant purposes. So there is more than that aren't certified with a BR. So I would say somewhere between 500 and 1,000.
Still a minor fraction of
that. Yeah, but I suppose it's important to say that. So your question of social housing stock first, and it would certainly eat all the budget. Of course it would. There's a social justice thing that you've said. People who've bought out a social house, they were incentivised to buy out the social house. Yes, they are private, but there's a lot of private fuel poor out there. And to say that they would be, not looked after in the same way that someone who hasn't bought out their social house, who hasn't put the capital into it, who hasn't put as much money into it, who doesn't look after their house, I think for me, I would say that's not right. I would say you need to look after all parts of society at a relatively equal manner. When it comes to the question around, if you take the 50 billion cost, that's housing alone. If you take the commercial building stock, it's probably the same again. We're talking about 100 billion over 30 years. How the public purse funds and incentivises that is a mixture of regulation, which you're going to hear about, I think, today, incentives, penalties, and market development stuff, and that sort of facilitating the market. I don't think. If the state chooses to incentivise people with the carbon tax or a grant, it's two sides of the one coin. If you don't have that cost effectiveness for someone, they will not invest. So you either need to make it a regulation to force them to do it, and best to look to any government that says you must go and spend 30 grand on your house and we're not going to help you with it. So it is a question of whether we have the stomach for the carbon tax to push people in to make the payback low enough so they will make the investment and all the market development stuff that goes with that, or whether you have an incentive and a lower carbon tax. Now, if you look at what does a grant of 30% do, it's probably cost neutral to the Exchequer or near enough, because the tax on those workers who pay that, the VAT alone on the 100% grant is already a big part of that 30%. So a 30% grant, and maybe there are other people who are more qualified in terms of finance could say, but certainly from the analysis that I've seen, a 30% grant is pretty much cost neutral to the state if it incentivises 100% of work, if that makes sense. So if you have €100, tax revenue for that is likely to be the €30. So when we say that, we kind of mean, you know, a 30% grant is more or less the state not taking a share out of that renovation, which is what would happen if we didn't have any support. How do we get to the 2%? So there's a couple of models around Europe that we can see, and it's important to always look outside of Europe. So the German public KfW bank, it's a non-profit bank, they get their 20%, or their 2%. There is a region in France called Picardy where the state has the regional government have guaranteed the other 20% that the EIB isn't guaranteeing, so it's very low-cost finance. And the money comes from a combination of the equivalent of a credit union and the EIB, and it's 2.5% or 2.25% over 20 years unsecured. And it's really, really hard. Now, I've been in discussions with credit unions, with banks, with ISIF, with various other parties. I don't see how you will get a commercial bank to offer 2%. There is no way, because they don't make any money on it, as you said. So I would be very much in favour of a certain amount of that grant being buying down the loan interest rate. But we need to de-risk it first so that you pull down the actual cost of it before you start subsidising, because otherwise what you're just going to do is subsidise profit. From a payback point of view, and from how many years is the loan, that depends on how big the carbon tax is. That depends on how expensive the fossil fuels are. If you're Denmark and you're 18 cent a kilowatt hour for your oil and 15 cent a kilowatt hour for your gas, the payback is much shorter than your 5 cent for gas and 8 cent for oil that you have in Ireland. So the payback is based on what the payback is, and it all, like, it's, you know, this is a scale, and you can decide your carbon tax and you can decide your grant levels, but ultimately if you don't have a payback at 10% or 10 years or less, you will not incentivise someone. They will not feel that it is good value for money for them to do. So I think that's an important thing to say, is you've got that slider. It's a public policy lever that we can do, but we're currently doing neither, and that's why we have 500 to 1,000 of those retrofits. But I suppose it's important to say that if we don't get the market development stuff right, and don't have lots of contractors who are trained, and don't have the easy access to the market, those numbers will all need to be higher. You'll need to have higher subsidy and higher carbon tax to get the same output. And the question around targeting rural Ireland first, you know, when you see someone burning 10, 12, 14 tonnes of peat a year to heat a 50 square metre mass concrete home, and it goes to a heat pump burning 1,900 kilowatt hours of 30% green electricity, or soon to be 70, there's a big opportunity there, from whether it's environmental, health, everything else, you know. And coming from a rural county, of course you should target rural counties first. But even for every other reason, like your gas network is in Dublin, you're not going to start taking houses off the gas with 12 tonnes of peat going into another house if you're limited in money. Absolutely. There's the just transition and the workers in Bournemouth and so on that we hear a lot about. However, you know, I think I would be more concerned about the issues in social justice and carbon tax and people who can't afford it than you know, any of those drivers of heavy machinery will get jobs in construction in Dublin in a minute. You know, we're constrained in the capacity of workers, so I would be less concerned about those and much more concerned about the huge impact that you can have when you take out a solid fuel system versus you know, from all of the other reasons, and particularly where you've got mass concrete, ex-local authority cottages that were bought out, and you know, that type of rural one-offs or whatever it is, the savings can be environmentally really can be huge. So, and you know, in terms of bringing workers home, yeah, there is capacity in rural Ireland to house people. There isn't in Dublin. less capacity than we'd like, but it's certainly more there. And I know where we can get staff into the agency, and I have a senior engineer coming from Perth next month, and that's the only place you're going to get design engineers, because there is no capacity in the market right now.
Kenny, Mr. Barry.
Just on the low interest loans, this conversation, this whole discussion came up about 5 years ago, when SEAI were developing the Better Energy Finance, which was that was tracking the UK Green Deal, and the whole intention was to transition completely away from grants towards low interest loans. Now, the only commercially viable loans that the banks were suggesting were possible were around 7%. So there was a lot of work done on seeing what the costs of subsidising that down to, I think it was modelled right down to 2% and 1%. So that work has been done, so it should be available, and what the actual costs of doing that. There was quite a lot of work done with the banks at the time. In terms of, and I think we can do a lot with green mortgages paid over a longer period of 10 or 20 years, because then the additional cost to the mortgage is insignificant and actually does, it almost is as it does pay for the energy bills. In terms of prioritising rural housing, perhaps we should focus more on rural villages and towns, because you're going to get better payback there, because if you renovate abandoned homes or unused homes in those towns, not only does it cost less, because if you've got a single house, you have to insulate 4 walls, so it costs twice as much to renovate as, say an apartment above a shop in a rural town. So it costs a fraction of the cost to renovate that to a high standard. And then what you're also doing is you're taking those people. So if a house is reaching the end of its life in a rural situation, it might be better saying move them 1 kilometre into the local village and live in an apartment above a shop. So if we think laterally about it, then we bring life into that town, and then they don't need a car, so you're reducing the carbon from both the house and also from the transport. And there's some great work happening around the Limerick regeneration at the moment, in how they're reimagining Limerick, the centre of Limerick, by renovating the old Georgian buildings. And what they're looking at doing is transforming the streets as well, to bring life back to them, so that families will move into the centre of Limerick, renovate a property, and they're removing cars from the streets, so there's life, there's playgrounds in the streets. I think it's really inspiring, and that approach to maybe targeting some of our smaller towns. If you look at towns like Dungarvan, there's great potential there to turn that into a really, it already is become the Greenway has made it a very vibrant place. But there's so many abandoned houses in Dungarvan that could be turned into really excellent accommodation for people, and that then removes the need both for one-off housing, and it brings life, and it makes those places attractive to live in.
I agree 100%. And if it is possible to get a copy of that bank research from 4 years ago in the UK, if you could forward it to myself, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I think it was done here. It was done as part of the Better Energy Finance.
Okay, so SEAI
should have some data on it.
Track that down. Thank you, Chair.
Just 2 quick observations. I mean, in some sense, the solution to the loan finance is what already exists in the social housing sector. I mean, we have a housing finance agency. They provide government-backed low-interest loans, 2 to 3% blended. I suppose the issue is a political question as they're on balance sheets, so whether the state is willing to take that on. But you could easily design a facility which either could be run through the SEAI or a standalone body modelled on the housing finance agency. And even with a very significant amount of borrowing, it wouldn't have too much of an impact on the government's debt to GDP balance now, given where the economy is going. So if we were serious about the scale of it, as you've all said, maybe that's the thing we need to be looking at and arguing for, which is, rather than going for very, very convoluted off-balance sheet private sector financing models, which are always going to be more expensive anyway, just say, look, if this is the priority that we say it is, then what you need is something equivalent to the HFA, to deal with that. Likewise, for example, the credit unions are now at least allowed to lend into housing. It couldn't be a huge stretch to say, and they're talking about up to 3% of a loan, it wouldn't be a huge stretch to say, could one of their products be deep retrofitting, and that would be eminently sensible. The other thing is, and I wanted to say just because Eamon was here, but I do think it's important, when we talk about low-income families, it's really important that we talk about low-income families based on their income and not their tenure. And this is so important. Like, the ESRI has now given us the research to show 70% of renters in the lower income deciles face huge housing costs, up to 40% of their net disposable income. So I kind of want to confer with your point, which is we absolutely need to target lower income families, but a lot of those are in the private rental sector, but also a lot of them are in the owner-occupier sector. I mean, if you look at new buildings built and bought between 1999 and 2009, only 1% of those has an A grade. Lots and lots of those people are in very, very significant financial difficulty, financial distress, with very, very high housing costs. So I do agree with Eamon. I think we need far greater loan finance, but where grant finance has been targeted, it needs to be targeted particularly at those people, whether they're council tenants or homeowners, that are in those lower income brackets, and there's a lot of them outside of that. I suppose the last thing is just this. I do think there's a third option to the two options you outlined, and it's about an attractive loan offering, easy delivery, but phase-out dates. I mean, we did it with Smoky Coals, for example, and I think we do need to, well, that kind of very firm regulation by the state went out of fashion for 30 years. I think given the scale of the crisis that we have, that has to be part of the conversation as well. So while it's fine to talk about how we can use pricing points to incentivise behaviour, if you have the right loan provision and grant provision, and if you have the kind of speedy, easy implementation, we can then start to have conversations about target dates. So, for example, with the private rental market, I mean, if we're offering landlords a loan that's payable back at very sensible rates, there's no reasons why you couldn't say by this year you have to get up to this target, but then see 5 or 10 years on from that you have to move to the next target. Because I think if we don't have those very, very firm legal regulations, the market left to its own devices, even with an even balance of carrot and stick, might not necessarily end up in that particular point. So I think that has to be part of the conversation as well.
Do you want to come back in on?
Yeah, I would strongly agree. We should have a phase-out date for fossil fuel boilers. It should start with new build straight away. Then it should be oil in the public sector. Then it should be oil in the private sector. Then it should be gas in the public sector and gas in the private sector over the next 15 to 20 years. Absolutely. It's something that I would believe very strongly in. But it's very hard to do that when we're currently putting in new oil and gas boilers, well, certainly gas, in new public buildings and in renovated public buildings.
And new homes. Sure.
And I thank all our witnesses for attending this morning. We went well over, but I think we'll agree that was hugely important and beneficial to the committee in putting a report together. So thank you very much for the level of detail you shared with us this morning. Members, I propose that we suspend the meeting just for 5 minutes to allow our second session to take their seats. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thanks. Public session. At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode depending on their device. Not sufficient to put your phones on silent mode as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting systems. Item number 7 on the agenda is energy efficient housing, and in our second session today we will resume the topic energy efficient heating. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome to today's meeting Mr Jim Gannon, Mr Jim Shear and Ms Orla Coyle from SEAI, and Mr Sean Armstrong and Mr Al Dean from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, and Mr Robert Deegan and Ms Eileen O'Connor from the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment. Before we begin, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Sorry, you have to read that out the second time because we suspended the meeting. So I'd now like to call on... I'll start from the beginning again, will I? So I'd now like to call on Mr Robert Deegan from the Department to make his opening statement.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to this morning's meeting on the subject of energy efficient housing. As you mentioned, I'm joined by Eileen O'Connor, Assistant Principal Officer in the Energy Efficiency and Affordability Division in the Department. Energy efficiency has long been a focus of Irish energy policy. This is because energy efficiency measures are among the most cost-effective methods of reducing emissions while providing tangible benefits to people and businesses. Ireland's target for improving energy efficiency is 20% by 2020, and we are currently on track to achieve 16% efficiency by that deadline. While this represents solid progress, there's clearly more to be done, especially in the context of new, more demanding targets for 2030 that will be established as part of the forthcoming all-of-government climate action plan. The residential sector accounts for a quarter of Ireland's total energy usage and approximately 10% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. For that reason, improving the energy efficiency of our housing stock is one of the main areas of focus in order to achieve our overall efficiency goals. There are two key energy efficiency challenges to be addressed in Ireland's residential building sector, and these were touched upon earlier on in the earlier session. Firstly, we must build a generation of new homes that meet our expectations in terms of comfort and functionality, while also significantly reducing our energy use and CO2 emissions. Secondly, we must address the legacy of older housing with poor energy efficiency performance and high levels of CO2 emissions. The Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government has the lead role in relation to energy efficiency of new homes, while the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment supports a range of measures to help households improve the energy efficiency of homes. I'll therefore focus my comments today on the steps being taken by the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment to improve the energy efficiency of existing homes. To date, the central plank of the Department's efforts to drive demand for energy efficiency upgrades has been grant schemes funded by the Department and administered by the SEAI. A range of grant schemes are available to householders and communities to suit their circumstances and the scale of work they wish to undertake. For instance, grants covering part of the cost of retrofits are available to those that can afford to invest some of their own funds, while 100% funding is available for those on lower incomes at risk of fuel poverty. The Department also funds pilot schemes focused on particular issues, such as the challenges associated with upgrading houses to A building energy ratings and learning about the wider health and well-being benefits of energy upgrades for individuals with chronic illness. Funding is also provided to support community-based partnerships to improve the energy efficiency of the building stock in their area and to encourage innovative measures and solutions. This will include those at risk of energy poverty, community facilities and businesses. The grant schemes have evolved over time in line with the policy objectives of the Government. For instance, within the last year, the measures available under the schemes have been expanded to promote deeper measures and support the transition away from grant aid for fossil fuel heating systems. The total funding allocated for these schemes in 2019 is £85 million, and this represents an increase of £40 million compared to 2015. Since 2000, over 400,000 homes have received direct support under these schemes to carry out work such as installing insulation, heating controls or solar panels to heat water. In 2018 alone, 21,350 households and 37 community groups received support to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. However, despite this investment, over 80% of homes still have a building energy rating of C or lower. When compared with other EU countries, our homes use 7% more energy and emit nearly 60% more emissions. The Government has accepted the need to redouble our efforts to improve the efficiency of our homes. This is evident from the ambitious commitments made in the National Development Plan. The NDP has identified a target of upgrading 45,000 homes to a building energy rating of B for each year of the lifetime of the plan from 2021. This represents a very significant increase in the number and depth of retrofit delivery. In order to support the achievement of this target, funding of £3 billion, as well as an additional £700 million for switching oil boilers to heat pumps and providing solar technology in existing homes, has been allocated under the plan. This is clearly a substantial level of government financial support. However, as Minister Bruton has previously indicated and as discussed earlier, exchequer investment alone will not be enough to meet the level of retrofit required. The overall targets could only be achieved by individuals making the decision to play their part in addressing climate change by investing some of their own money in upgrading their homes. We must now design initiatives to encourage and support people to make these decisions. The Department is of the view that maintaining a focus on the existing grant schemes will not be sufficient to bring about the targeted level of retrofit activity. The Department therefore intends to continue to work closely with the SEAI to identify the lessons that can be learned from the schemes and apply those lessons in designing future approaches. Other steps must also be taken to encourage, support and facilitate energy efficiency upgrades. These could include the introduction of new delivery models to support more widespread retrofit activity, building the supply chain to ensure that necessary businesses and workers are in place and available, addressing the particular challenges associated with rented accommodation, encouraging greater use of building energy ratings, and the development of novel financing schemes to fill the funding gap. All of this will need to be underpinned by strengthened regulatory measures and the establishment of a more consolidated approach to measuring retrofit activity and impact. Over the past number of months, the Department has been working closely with other government departments and agencies, including the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government and the SEAI, to develop new measures for inclusion in the forthcoming all-of-government Climate Action Plan. The plan will build on the targets set in the NDP and outline the steps that Ireland will take to become a leader in climate action, including in the area of energy-efficient housing. It is anticipated that commitments in relation to the built environment, including homes, will be core elements of the plan. In conclusion, significant progress has been made on improving the energy efficiency of our homes. We must now learn from what has worked in the past, as well as the experiences in other jurisdictions, to design the additional interventions required to meet the Government's new level of ambition for energy efficiency and carbon emissions. We're happy to address any questions that the committee may have. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Robert. On to Mr. Armstrong from the Department of Housing.
Chair, members, good morning and thank you for the opportunity to address the Joint Committee on Housing, Planning and Local Government on this topic of energy efficient housing. I am joined by my colleague Mr Alan Dean, Principal Officer, Building Standards. At the outset, Chair, I would like to say a few words about Project Ireland 2040, which the Government launched last year. Project Ireland 2040 is the overarching planning and investment framework for the social, economic and cultural development of Ireland. It includes a detailed capital investment plan for the period 2018 to 2027. The €116 billion National Development Plan, or NDP, in support of a long-term transformational spatial strategy, the National Planning Framework, or NPF, with a time horizon out to 2040. The aligned and shared vision of the NPF, in tandem with the NDP, represents a joined-up planning and investment strategy for Ireland's future growth and development, focused on a series of 10 shared national outcomes. It includes a number of ambitious climate action objectives specific to the built environment sector, including delivering more sustainable growth of compact and connected cities, towns and villages. Greater energy efficiency is a key benefit of this type of compact growth. Higher density residential development tends to comprise smaller units, which require less energy to heat. Multi-storey and terrace buildings in close proximity require less energy and make renewables-based systems of energy distribution, such as district heating or area-wide technology upgrades, more feasible. Over the past few months, we have been engaging very proactively with the K on the preparation of the new all-of-government plan to tackle climate disruption across multiple areas, including in particular the built environment, and we are driving a number of actions that will contribute to the energy efficiency of housing. The retrofitting of existing dwellings is the responsibility of the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment, and we support this policy in a number of ways. The Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government has responsibility for setting energy performance standards for new homes and those undergoing major renovation. In Ireland, approximately 40% of total energy produced is used in the building sector. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive sets ambitious goals for energy efficiency and renewables in buildings by requiring nearly zero energy buildings, or NZEB, performance for new buildings from the 31st of December 2020. In addition, the directive also requires that major renovations to existing buildings are completed to a cost-optimal level where it is feasible. The implementation of NZEB is a key action for the built environment in contributing to Ireland's National Low Carbon Transition and Mitigation Plan. I will focus first on what we are doing to achieve NZEB in new dwellings. We have progressively updated standards relating to the conservation of fuel and energy in dwellings over the last decade, with the aim of improving the energy and carbon dioxide emissions performance of all new dwellings to NZEB performance levels. Because of this, the final step on the NZEB journey is not as significant as it might otherwise be. Many of the techniques introduced in 2007, such as mandatory renewables for new dwellings, more energy-efficient boilers and efficient fabric, have effectively eased the transition and minimised the additional costs and effort required at this stage to achieve the NZEB performance for dwellings. Last month, Minister Murphy signed the European Union Energy Performance of Buildings regulations, which represent an improvement of 70% of energy and carbon dioxide emissions performance over 2005 standards for all new dwellings commencing construction from November this year, subject to the necessary transitional arrangements. An update to Part F for ventilation of the building regulations will also be signed shortly. A modelling and cost study was carried out to estimate the cost impact of NZEB. The average uplift in cost across all dwelling types modelled was 1.9%. When compared with the energy savings to the occupants over the lifetime of the house, this delivers real value, benefiting people's lives by bringing comfort and convenience, mitigating against energy poverty and ill health, as well as providing the societal benefits of lower carbon emissions. Under the previous regulations, a typical new dwelling is built to an A3 building energy rating. The NZEB requirements will equate to an A2 building energy rating. This represents a 70% improvement in energy efficiency and a 70% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions compared to 2005. It also introduces 20% renewables as a percentage of the total building energy use. An analysis of Central Statistics Office data shows that 97% of dwellings built since 2015 have achieved an A rating. The NZEB requirements make it more attractive for builders and homeowners to further incorporate renewable technologies and move away from traditional fossil fuels. The Central Statistics Office analysis of building energy rating data demonstrates that this shift away from fossil fuels, the installation of oil boilers, has dropped from 36% to 5% in new dwellings since 2015. And electrical systems, or heat pumps, make up 38% of heating systems in new dwellings. This percentage is growing steadily each year. These new performance requirements mean that heat pumps have effectively displaced oil boilers in new dwellings. This regulation is set at cost-optimal levels. It is performance-based and technology neutral. The cost-optimal level performance is the best energy performance that can be achieved in a building for the lowest lifetime cost when both capital costs and operating costs are accounted for over a 30-year period. The availability of a choice of different energy systems delivers economic benefits, including competition and choice for consumers. It is a matter for the designer to choose the best, most suitable technologies to achieve the required performance. The cost optimal calculations are reviewed every 5 years, and regulations will be amended if performance levels deviate off cost optimal. This regular assessment and flexibility provides opportunities to capture the benefits of innovation and economies developed in industry over time in regulations. It is estimated that the cumulative improvements to regulations mean that a dwelling built to the 2011 Part L regulations requires 90% less energy than the equivalent dwelling built in 1978 to deliver the same standards of heat, hot water and light. This shows the very significant progress that has already been made in the standards for new buildings. In relation to existing buildings, the challenge is inevitably more difficult. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive requires that where buildings are undergoing major renovation, the whole building should be brought up to a cost-optimal level, insofar as this is technically, functionally and economically feasible. Major renovation means where more than 25% of the surface area of the building envelope undergoes renovation. Our technical guidance documents provide detailed guidance on how this can be achieved in practice for buildings undergoing a major renovation. The performance levels have been set to be proportionate to the original cost of works and ambitious but realistic, so as not to create an unintended barrier to renovation. Of course, building regulations will not increase renovation rates in themselves, but they will ensure that when renovations are carried out, they are carried out to this level, typically equivalent to a B2 building energy rating. In relation to social housing, funding of some €128 million has been provided from 2013 to the end of 2018 to improve energy efficiency and comfort levels in almost 68,000 local authority homes. In addition, energy-efficient measures have been incorporated into the 9,000+ vacant social housing units that have been returned to productive use since 2014. This effectively means that approximately 50% of our social housing stock has been retrofitted. While energy efficiency activity had traditionally been focused on the refurbishment of vacant properties, the current energy retrofitting programme, launched in 2013, was aimed more broadly at the housing stock, and particularly to improve the energy efficiency of older apartments and houses by reducing heat loss through the fabric of the building, in order to improve comfort levels and address issues around fuel poverty. This social housing programme has two phases. Phase 1 focused on the lower cost improvements, such as cavity wall and attic insulation. Phase 2 is now targeting higher cost measures, for example, fabric upgrades and glazing. There are significant costs associated with this deeper retrofit. We estimate up to €1.8 billion to upgrade 60,000 social dwellings to a B2 rating, a typical cost of €30,000 per dwelling. In addition to the areas I've just outlined, we are supporting local authorities who are taking a strong leadership role in piloting one-stop shops for retrofit in conjunction with SEAI. We are working very hard to meet housing demand, both in relation to new build and in the private rented sector. We have ambitious targets in terms of the quantity, type and location of homes to be delivered, and we are also ambitious for climate action, including energy efficient housing. Through our building regulations, we are ensuring that the quality of the homes we are building for future generations continues to achieve the high standards we are setting for decarbonising our built environment. We are happy to address any questions the committee may have.
Thanks, Sean. I'd now like to call on Mr Jim Gannon for his opening statement.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll make a couple of key points off the earlier slides and then I'll delve into a little bit more detail as we move along. On the first slide you see in front of yourself, the key point here is that Irish homes are about 7% more energy efficient, well, less energy efficient than the European average, but we are about 58% worse off in terms of CO2 against the European average. So I think particularly as we look towards 2030 and our targets become more focused on CO2, we must look to decarbonise as we increase energy efficiency. So the type of heat that we use, oil, gas, moving towards heat pumps and other types of decarbonised heat becomes quite a bit more important. On the next page, I think it's important to consider how big housing is in Ireland. So again, two key points to take off this slide is that a quarter of all energy used in Ireland is consumed in our homes. And 60% of this is space heating. So again, this piece around heat in our residential sector and how we heat in terms of carbon comes into very stark relief in terms of how we decarbonise Ireland. Moving to the next slide, considering where we've come from, I'll just make 2 key points here again. Over 400,000 homes have been upgraded through Exchequer-funded SEAI grants over 15 years. That is 400,000 people who made a decision to do something with regard to energy efficiency in their home. That sort of bite-sized chunk makes a very material difference in terms of how we design future programmes and the fact that we can have confidence that there can be high volume uptake. Second piece in terms of new dwellings is that 70%, our new dwellings are 70% more efficient than those built in 2005. So again, in terms of the baseline of where we were for building regs and the baseline of where we are, I think it's important to make that point. Moving on to SEAI programmes, I'll just take a quick look at 2018. On the right-hand side, what we're trying to show is that our different programmes look at shallow and look at medium and look at deeper retrofit. While our deep retrofit programme looks at where the housing stock needs to be by 2050, we need to be realistic and say that we're not going to get every home in Ireland to move to that in a single step. So we need to look at how we can finance and how we can technically deliver a smaller, stepwise transition towards that level. I think as well there are varying levels of activity within that, so people tend to do more volume of shallower retrofits. Importantly, we funded the upgrade of about 21,000 homes last year, separately and distinct from that cohort, motivated by the obligated parties under the EOS programme that sits under the stewardship of DCCAE. An additional 20,000 homes underwent some form of energy retrofit, granted at a shallow level. But that is in and around 40,000 homes who made a decision to upgrade their home. So how do we motivate these people to make it deeper and help them finance that? Because the technology is there. I think it's very important to understand some of the technical challenges that are there, and I'll speak to supply chain later on. But also important to consider the opportunity is there too. So about 300,000 homes are heat pump ready right now in terms of their fabric. They don't have to do deeper retrofit of their windows, of their walls, of their attics. They are ready to go. So how do we locate these? And for us, with the Building Energy Rating database, and comparing that specifically to where the small area economic data of the CSO tells us we have people who can pay, people who have more difficulty paying, it's a very powerful resource for that policy decision-making process that will follow. Just a quick note then on the next page on new buildings. To my mind, trends are quite important. So if you look at 2010 and you look at the khaki green, that represented about 30% of oil boilers in all new builds. If you look to the right-hand side, it is about 3% of new builds in 2018. In fact, this year's moved down to less than 2%. So a negligible number percentage-wise of oil boilers going in. What interests me is that over the pathway from 2010 until now, for the first period, gas displaced oil. But for the latter half, heat pumps have been displacing oil and growing to a point where they're nearly 50% in 2019 so far, in the first few months, of what is supplying heat to new builds. So again, the trend is there, we are moving in the right direction. It's how we increase the volume and help people finance that. In terms of retrofit targets and challenges, the BER database shows that 94% of buildings are at B3 or less. Under the 2018 revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, we need to publish a long-term renovation strategy to upgrade our building stock to NZEB by 2050. Which is another leap altogether. And this is the larger numbers that have been mentioned earlier on by other people. I think what's key is that many of the technologies and practices are available, but not at the volume and skill level in terms of competency and supply chain required. And separately, we need to look at trigger points for those individuals to make a decision to spend that money on their home. So is it at the purchase of a house? Is it at a change in lease of a house? Is it during a typical renovation where we get them to go further? Is it at a point where they receive their retirement lump sum? And again, the demographics that we're involving ourselves with tell us that that is a particular point where you can engage people in improving their home. On the finance piece, I think it's very important to recognise what has gone before. So right now, SEAI has tested employee incentive programmes, low-interest finance with credit unions over a number of years. We are working actively with the European Investment Bank and SBCI here in Ireland to look at that low finance loan offering. I think a couple of things are very important, though. If you take the par of what loans are offered in terms of personal finance in Europe and you de-risk it by about 4%, you might get to 2%. But if you take par here for what personal loans are offered at, it's naturally higher. So to look at an absolute target of 2%, instead of saying, well, really in Europe they've reduced it or de-risked it by about 3 or 4%, making it more appetising to people, in Ireland our starting bar is higher. So it's really the differential you can bring it down. So by de-risking it and using EIB, you might be able to bring it down 3 or 4%. You still might have 3 or 4 left instead of the 2 in Europe, because you're starting from a different baseline. Similarly, pay-as-you-save, I think we will see more of that in the future as the obligated parties become more interested. And I think the final piece is around the sociological impact of deep retrofit, where with our behavioural economics team, we're looking at the wider benefits and how people value those. So why do people, for example, do a cost-benefit analysis on insulating their attic, but not on buying a Belfast sink or a marble countertop? In terms of building energy rating, a key point on this is that more will be asked of the building energy rating, but it is a tool that we can derive far greater value from, in terms of looking at people's homes, the value of same, and in terms of advising them more explicitly on what they can do to their home and the payback. And an extended and deepened advisory report will come out with everyone's BER from the end of this year onwards. A key gap is the supply chain, moving to my second to last slide. Again, we've upgraded 400,000 homes at different levels of retrofit over the last 10 to 15 years. We know where weaknesses in the supply chain are. We know geographically where weaknesses in the supply chain are. So as a result of that, we work with people like the NSAI on developing specific national standards, and also with bodies like the Wexford and Waterford ETBs on developing that sort of supply chain. We agree with all stakeholders that there is a significant challenge there, especially where there's a buoyant construction economy right now. Finally, on to SEAI priorities from our perspective. Alternative options for housing retrofit finance. We believe that there is no single solution for all demographics. You might have a need for residual grants, but it's not a preferred option because it becomes a structural market support, and you don't want grants to ever become that. You need to look at low interest finance. You need to look at tax rebate at purchase of a home. You need to look at something also like the HRI, where it's tax rebate at renovation of a house. In terms of one-stop shop for homeowner journey, there are many different examples of how this has worked in different jurisdictions, and we believe that for volume, for aggregated demand and for confidence, people need to be brought through that pipeline, and that it is important to offer this into the market. We would just caution that we need to try to remove, where possible, the advisor from procurement decisions that could influence their income. So I need to make sure that I'm getting truly objective advice in any model like that, so it can't be sharpened in any way. I think minimum performance regulation is essential, and by this it's speaking to Darragh O'Brien's point where phase-out dates could be considered. I think a method of looking at that is looking at the commercial sector first, perhaps, where socially and politically one could become acclimatised to setting a performance target at change of lease, and that we will also provide some incentive or assistance to make that happen, and then allow that to come towards the residential sector, where the residential sector right now in itself is quite sensitive to that sort of market intervention, I would have said. The final one then really is around targeted communications. So finding that key decision point in a person's life or in the life of the building to provide them with the ability to do it, which is to finance it, and then the appetite to do it, which is moving them to want to execute. And I'll finish on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gannon. Owen.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the presentation, and we'll reassure you, just because there's less of us doesn't mean we won't give you a hard time and take up as much of your time as we did of the others. So look, I've lots of questions, and maybe I'll ask some in the first round, and I'll come back to some of the others. So let me start first of all with NZEP. One of the things I'm not clear on is in terms of the 2018 obligations that we have in terms of all new public buildings. The section in the presentation talks about 97% of dwellings built in 2015 have achieved an A rating, and I have asked a couple of parliamentary questions wanting to know where we're moving in terms of the A2 rating, and I've got responses saying 98% of all new dwellings are built to an A3 rated BER, but of course A2 is the standard. So I'm just, rather than me just putting more PQs and upsetting all of you guys, where are we at in terms of the 2018 A2 rating requirements? Because what I'm not clear in the PQs I've got back from both government departments is who's actually monitoring this. I'm very clear that it's Housing's responsibility to have the planning and technical guidance documents. It's climate and communication in terms of the policy. But who's checking to make sure this happens? Because obviously, particularly as we get to 2020, that's going to become increasingly important. So any information on where we're at with the A2 in terms of the 2018 obligations and the monitoring would be very valuable. I'm looking at the SEAI slide here, and it's one of the things I've been trying to get my head around from the CSO data. Am I right in thinking that only 1.25% of our residential stock is A2 or higher? So A2 or A1? Because again, it's for those of us that don't work in this area technically, I think it would be really valuable for us to know, what volume of the residential stock needs to be moved into that direction by the 2030 deadline to give ourselves a sense of the scale of it. On the NZEB requirements that are about to be published, and obviously those of us in this committee haven't been involved in that process, taking on board what was said in the earlier session in terms of gas boilers, was there consideration to including in those regulations phase-out dates? I mean, if the argument is we don't have the skills or expertise or industry capacity to simply prevent them from being phased out now, was it considered to incentivise the industry and government to get it greater capacity by having phase-out dates? Is that something that's still being considered, and is it open for consideration yet? And if we were to take the advice earlier and have a series of phase-out dates for oil boilers and gas boilers, what do people think would be possible, credible, just knowing where the industry is at and the skill set are at and the costs, etc.? There was also another wonderful line in the Department of Housing's presentation here. Excuse me. So you talked about the Minister signing the European Union regulations, and obviously then there were some targets there, but it said subject to the necessary transitional arrangements. So again, if you can give us more information in terms of where they're at. In terms of finance, we've spent a lot of time in this committee looking at finance in terms of housing, because many of the same challenges in terms of the conversation we're having here today, we have in terms of housing for approved housing bodies, for small and medium-sized builders in the private sector, and for local authorities. I mean, are all the discussions about how to try and de-risk and reduce the cost of private finance, or is there any attempt to look at housing finance agency type ways of funding loan finance? Because that does provide much more attractive options in terms of the cost of the finance to the borrower, albeit with the borrowing being on the state's balance sheet, even if it's sourced from the EIB or elsewhere, because it's guaranteed by the state. And likewise, in terms of the credit union finance, and again, there are all sorts of issues there, which we've been discussing at great length here, in terms of when the credit union sector are ready to have a special purpose vehicle to lend into the approved housing body sector. But are you guys involved in a similar conversation? Because that seems to me, again, another eminently sensible source of finance. And again, Home Building Finance Ireland. I mean, here's a fund with €750 million of taxpayers' money. It's going to leverage in that same amount from the private sector, and it's going to lend to small and medium-sized builders. At any stage where either of the departments involved in discussions to see, could we maximise the benefit of that lending to small and medium-sized builders to ensure that those buildings have the highest possible energy efficiency levels? And if not, do you think that would be something worthwhile? And then the final two questions in this round. Training. Obviously, that's primarily the responsibility of another government department. It's probably remiss of us. We just didn't think about inviting them in. We might do it at another stage. Are you in discussions with them? Are they part of the conversation in terms of interdepartmental engagement to try and fill those skills and capacity gaps? And then on social housing, like 128 million from 2013 to 2018 is only 21 million annually. So it's pretty small amounts of money in terms of the overall capital budget that the department has. Is there, in terms of the annual spend, if I understand the figures correctly, are there discussions about how to increase that? Because in none of the information I've got either today or from the CSO do we know the BER rating of the social housing stock. And one of my questions is that information available? Can you tell us how many units are A, B, C, D, etc.? And I think one of the figures there was a lot of the retrofits are bringing them up to a B rating. do we know how many of the social housing stock owned by local authorities approved housing bodies have an A rating at all? Is that information there? I'll come back to some others in the second round.
So,
Sorry to fill your heads.
Robert, I'll go to you first. Mr. Deegan, sorry. Yeah.
I know some of those matters more closely relate probably to the housing side, but just on the financing element, actually just a more general comment on a lot of these issues, it's the interlinked nature of them. And we need to be kind of careful that we tackle each and come up with a kind of a comprehensive and overarching approach to achieving our objectives. The reason for that is if you were to kind of focus on the increasing demand and increasing access to finance, but then you don't have access to the skills and the training and those kinds of things, all you're effectively going to do is increase the unit cost and not achieve the carbon targets or the energy efficiency targets. So a lot of the issues that we're talking about today, they can be siloed off, but they need to come together into a kind of a cohesive approach. On the issues related to the financing models, I mean, as Mr. Gannon mentioned earlier on, there's been a lot of work that's been undertaken in this area for a number of years. I don't think there's any particular we're not wedded to any particular approach. What we'll do, whichever approach we'll be taking, each will be evaluated and we'll be looking at the approach that best meets the objectives that we've been set. We'll also need to look at how the financing schemes and the grant schemes interact together, because they have to be seen again as a cohesive whole as opposed to kind of a one-off, just look at the finance in isolation from the grants, because an awful lot of the research that's been published in this area, much of it done by the SEAI, has kind of shown the importance and the interlinked nature of finance products and grants, and the fact that the grants might reduce the effective interest rate that's being paid, but still needing to have an attractive low interest rate to drive the demand for the finance products. In terms of the discussions on the training aspect, one of the great things about an all-of-government climate plan is it's bringing all of the relevant players around the table. So it is a genuinely all-of-government approach to tackling an all-government problem. There has been engagement between the department, with the Department of Education and Science, but it's also about, you're looking at a number of players. You're looking at the Department of Housing, Standards, you're looking at Department of Education, SOLAS, in terms of training and apprenticeships and those kinds of things. You've got the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation in terms of having the businesses that are actually there as well, so that will be able to scale up to the level of retrofit activity that's planned in the future. One issue that will be there in terms of the training is that because much of the activity has been at the shallow end of the retrofit scale, there's a lot of people who with the expertise available to do that kind of work, and it's about upskilling those people to the deeper end and the more scientific and engineering kind of approaches that will be required. And I think that was alluded to earlier on today in terms of plumbing as one area. It needs to be plumbers with specialist expertise in the types of interventions that we'll be talking about. I think that kind of covers the aspects of my department, unless there's anything else that you want us, maybe Sean might address the regulation part.
Okay. So I think the first question was around A3s and A2s, and what percentage are A2s and what percentage are A3s. So the current performance requirements are implemented through Part L of the building regulations. And in 2011, a performance requirement was introduced that was equivalent to A3. It isn't set as an A3, but it was equivalent to an A3. So, and that took full effect in 2013. The transition period for it finished in 2013. So, in the CSO data since 2015, it's shown that 97% of dwellings built from 2015 to currently are A3 rated dwellings, and that's because the minimum performance requirements by the building regulations was an A3. The NZEB requirement has been set based on the cost optimal calculations, which is the life cycle calculations, and it comes out as equivalent to an A2 rating for most dwellings. So that regulation was signed by the Minister at the end of last month. It was published 2 weeks ago, and with any building regulation, you have to give a lead-in time for the industry to prepare. So it takes effect for all new dwellings commencing after the 1st of November of this year, the 1st of November 2019. And then there's a one-year transition period which allows dwellings to get to wall plate level, because obviously there's a lot of buildings in design and have received planning at this stage, and it would be unfair really to ask them to go back and redesign when you've only given them a 6 months lead-in time. So that explains why there's a one-year transition period. So they have up to the 31st of October to get to wall plate level, and that leaves a reasonable amount of time for all dwellings to achieve the NZ performance requirement by the 31st of December 2020. The next question was about fossil fuel boilers. So I think when we're talking about phasing out fossil fuel boilers, I think we have to recognise that we have had a 10-year roadmap in place to improve the performance of dwellings. It started in 2007 when we introduced mandatory renewables and mandatory air tightness testing. So renewables were introduced in 2007. In 2011, we advanced the fabric performance and achieved an improvement in performance of 60% over 2005 levels. Now this year we're achieving the final step to NZEP, which is 70% over 2005 levels. So we've already gone through a roadmap of improving the performance requirements of buildings. And as Jim's slide showed, that it has had a significant effect already in implementing renewables and phasing out fossil fuel boilers. In the slides that Jim showed, 38% since 2015, less than 100 dwellings had heat pumps installed, and in the most recent CSO data, over 4,500 dwellings have heat pumps installed. Heat pumps have effectively displaced oil boilers in new dwellings. So we have begun the phase out of fossil fuel boilers. Also in the CS data, it shows that solid fuel is no longer being installed as the main heating source in new dwellings. So that was another point that was issued. But what remains is gas boilers. Now, the installation of gas boilers combined with solar PV has the same net emissions as a new dwelling with a heat pump installed. So the net emissions of the dwelling are the same, whether it's a gas boiler with PV or a heat pump installed. But notwithstanding that, we recognise the move towards the elimination of phasing out of fossil fuel boilers. But I think in all the points made earlier on, there was a recognition of capacity and building the supply chain. And there was talks about getting the technology working, having the right skills, training up the plumbing industry, training up apprentices. In order to build the supply chain, or in order to phase out fossil fuel boilers and move into gas fossil fuel boilers, we think it's important that the supply chain is developed. And standards need to be produced with NSAI, training courses need to be put in place, and competent installers need to be available to the market. Right now, that infrastructure is there to support the delivery of housing for gas boilers, but it needs to be developed for the heat pump market. In that regard, we are talking to Debbie and to the Department of Education and Skills in the All of Government Action Plan, and there are actions being developed to build a supply chain. But in addition to that, we're also working with the National Standards Authority of Ireland to develop a heat pump standard, and a proposal has been put forward to NSAI in the coming weeks to develop that national standard. We've also taken the Quali Build and Build Up training programme that has been developed, working with key stakeholders, and particularly Waterford-Wexford Educational Training Board. We've developed that into a national training specification for NZEB, and Waterford-Wexford ETB are delivering that at a regional level right now. And as part of the All of Government plan, we're in discussions with Department of Education and Skills about rolling that out at a national level. So we've made significant progress with the requirements for renewables, with the advancement of building regulations in phasing out fossil fuel boilers. We recognise that there can be further work done, and we're working with the relevant departments in order to build the capacity in the supply chain. And we will be reviewing our regulations, our current performance requirements, within the next 5 years to take account of any developments and innovations, and we will review our building regulations again at that stage to take account of any innovation in technology, reduction in costs, and the capacity of the supply chain to continue the roadmap towards the reduction of carbon emissions from new dwellings.
Sean, Mr. Gannon.
I'll be relatively brief. So about 1.2% of the housing stock is at A3 or above. Last year, as of previous years, we produced the 2018 Energy in the Residential Sector report, which goes into all of the national statistics. It'll give you a lot of that. We will forward it. Similarly, Cathaoirleach, we will forward, if you're happy for us to do it, an updated report on the different finance options in the residential sector that have been examined. I believe Deputy Ryan asked for it earlier. In terms of the different forms of finance, yes, we're having that. Bless you. Yes, we're having that discussion with the credit unions. Separately, in terms of the Housing Finance Agency, it is one of the options that is being considered, and I suppose part of what you said would have reflected whether or not it should be delivered differently with a focus on energy efficiency, or where one would just look at that product and say that perhaps a minimum performance should be A, B, C, D, or E. You know? So I think that it could be considered as a viable alternative. Finally, in terms of the social housing, particularly for our programmes, which are very commoditised, they're high volume in terms of transactions, we wanted to focus 2 years ago on where we could deal with single point landlords or equivalent. And an accessible route for us was the local authority stock and also the approved housing bodies. So for the last year and a half, we've been working with them to look at their portfolio and start looking at effectively a 5, a 7, a 10-year plan to bring that up to the standard we would like to see them brought up to. So the building energy rating doesn't discern between social housing stock and not, but that sort of data acquisition is going on right now and will be available, and we'd be happy to share that as a public body when it becomes available. I think importantly, with some of our funding this year and at the behest of the department, we started working with local authorities and housing bodies to see how can we move some of that funding more efficiently to a single grouping of homes with a single transaction, as distinct from 1,500 homes through 1,500 different transactions. And I think it becomes more important as we talk about building the supply chain. A second thing that isn't often discussed, but I think has to be discussed, is that if we can upskill our supply chain and get a very good insight into that social and public housing stock, if we enter into a counter-cyclical economic downturn in the next year to 2 years to 3 years, it presents itself as an incredible opportunity to retain skills, retain workers in this country, while investing in something we need to do by 2030. Because at some point in the next decade, we will have an economic downturn. And if we are prepared to take advantage of that while tackling climate concerns and we have the models in place, it is a huge opportunity to balance the supply chain and also to help us move towards 2030. And I think we shouldn't ignore that opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Gannon. Owen?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for all of that. A couple of additional questions and maybe just to pick up on some of the questions that were answered. Just in terms of the SEAI's grants, and obviously you talked about the number of people who had come to you and utilised grants, and therefore how can you activate those to go further. Do you keep a record of the number of people who came to you but weren't able to access grants, and how many are those? And because that's obviously another cohort, like constituency politicians often get queries from constituents who have been in touch and for a variety of reasons haven't been able to access the grants, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on some of that. To the two departments, one of the questions you didn't answer is who's going to monitor NZEP? And there are two bits to it. Obviously, there's the public building NZEP requirement, which is already in place from 2018, and I have a separate question about that. But there's also then, obviously, the private sector and commercial buildings from 2020. But also, for example, because the public building requirements come in place from the end of 2018, start of 2019, are all, for example, new social housing developments that are currently being developed going to hit that A2 rating? Or is there going to be a transitional period for that too? Like, I do notice there's far more solar in the social housing stock now than there might have been 2 years ago in terms of the new builds. And likewise with schools or with hospitals, or just talk us through, I suppose, the implementation of that. In terms of the new buildings, I suppose I have two concerns, and there's no doubt that on the basis of the slides that you presented us, the very significant decline in oil boilers is very real. But the level of gas boilers is pretty persistent. Okay, it goes up a little bit in 2013 and 14 and down again. But actually in quantity terms, because from 2010 to 2014 we were building virtually nothing, we're actually building far more homes with fossil fuel gas boilers now. So the actual negative impact in terms of carbon emissions is far greater, despite the fact that the graph makes it look slightly more positive. And I know I'm not accusing you of presenting it in that particular way, but it's just to make the point. So how, I suppose, is there the same plan to try and reduce the gas boilers in the way that there has been with the oil boilers, but also given the 2030 deadline, are we not just storing up an additional cost that householders are going to have to pay, or grants and loans are going to have to provide for, to remove those relatively recently installed gas boilers to replace them with heat pumps? And what can be done in the building regulations either to phase it out as quickly as possible, or if some of those gas boilers have to be removed in a decade, to make that as easy as possible? I'm particularly concerned about multi-unit developments. So while some of this is much more straightforward in a standard house, we're moving into a phase where we're going to have far more apartment developments, and making that kind of change from 100 apartments with 100 gas boilers to a district heating system is much more difficult if you haven't made some contingency in the planning now. We had detailed conversations, for example, when I was on South Dublin County Council about the Clonburra Strategic Development Zone, because we wanted to insert into that a requirement that even where multi-unit developments weren't necessarily going to have district heating now, they would be designed and built in such a way to make the transition to a district heating system much easier if and when we got to that stage. One of the questions I didn't ask at the earlier, the solar panel regulations. Like, is there any reason that just couldn't be done as quickly as the earlier presentation suggested? Is it really just a question of a statutory instrument, or is there some other problem that would block it? Because that seems to me an eminently sensible way to go. And then last thing on the finance, because the value, I suppose, of the HFA kind of model isn't just that you get that lower interest rate, but, for example, in the way in which the cocktail of funding for the approved housing body sector works, you also have the soft capital advance loan facility loan. So, in fact, it's a 100% loan, but it's done in a different way. So I suppose my question wasn't just you're looking at kind of government-backed low-interest loans, but also combining two different types of loans over a much longer period, or, you know, if that's all in the document, I won't ask you to rehash that. I'll just have a read of it. But again, the more information about that, the better. I think that's me, Chair.
So, Sean.
So I think the first question was about how is the NZEB regulations policed, and how is it policed for public buildings, and how is it policed for housing. So with regards to the public building requirement under the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, a circular would have been issued to government departments in December 2016 advising them of the NZEB requirement, and the circular advised that all buildings commencing design in January 2017 should be to NZEB performance. But quite soon after that, we would have gone for public consultation on our NZEB requirement for all non-residential buildings. And that NZEB requirement for all non-residential buildings applied to buildings commencing construction from the 1st of January 2019. So whilst many of the buildings, the public sector would have been responsible for designing buildings to NZEB that commenced design from January 2017. From the 1st of January 2019, all buildings that commenced construction were required to be NZEB. So really, the building regulations overtook the circular that had been issued to public sector bodies. So all buildings commencing construction from the 1st of January 2019, all non-residential buildings, buildings other than dwellings commencing construction from the 1st of January 2019 are required to be NSEB, and that's enforced by building control.
And just a question on that. So I presume then the answer to the question of who's monitoring that, that's through the BCAR system?
That's through the BCAR system, yeah.
And given, I suppose, the new areas of expertise, is the department satisfied that there's sufficient skills and competence among the assigned certifiers, who are essentially the watchdogs who are doing the inspections and submitting the reports to the building control management system? Are you satisfied about that? And is there not a requirement, maybe, given the importance of this, to have some additional level of monitoring or checking at a departmental level to make sure that in that first year or 2 years everything is going according to plan?
So we were conscious of the step up in technology and skills. We did extensive consultation with the industry, but as well SEAI, my colleagues here in SEAI also rolled out a programme of upskilling to designers on the new requirements for NSEB, and that was done countrywide. And I don't have the exact figure, but there was a large number of designers upskilled on these workshops.
And on that, would assigned certifiers, because obviously they're a key part of the monitoring, were assigned certifiers part of that training? I mean, are you satisfied that that section of the industry, who are the ones going out and inspecting the developments as they're being built and submitting the certs to the local authorities, that they have the requisite level of skills, not just the designers and construction workers, but the certifiers as well?
So I suppose there's a few aspects to the question. One is the assigned certifiers. So we have rolled out workshops to the assigned certifiers and BER assessors. We're also supporting the provision of CPD through RIAI and Engineers Ireland.
CPT is
continuing professional development, which would maybe focus more on the assigned certifier rather than the BER assessor. With regards to NSEB skills, we have had a lot of experience in the housing construction over the last 10 years, because housing construction has led the way, and we've also worked with Waterford Wexford ETB to develop a regional training programme on skills. But as the volume of construction increases in the housing sector, we'll need to provide more training and upskilling in that area.
Yep. Briefly, thank you, Cathaoirleach. Yes is the answer to your first question to me. So in mid-2016, we set out to put together a behavioural economics team to do two things. Firstly, look at the uptake of our own programmes, how many people got through, I hesitate to call it marketing, into a sales funnel, and what the drop-off rate was throughout that, and looking at people from their perspective, not just the complexity of grant. So if people came in for a single item, they likely followed through more so than people come in for 3 items, let's say. And also people with different perspectives were more likely to stay in and not. So we then started looking at methods of prompting them through that process at that point that they would normally drop out, because it's a 2, 3, 4, 5 stage process. Across warmer homes, more recently, in terms of take-up of that programme, we were able to analyse why people would respond to a letter to say, I would like that done to my home. We examined 4 different options, and the option that worked was where we changed the language from, would you like a government-funded grant to upgrade your home, to would you like a government-funded grant to upgrade your home worth, and we inserted the number. And lo and behold, percentage rate went up. Similar experience across heat pumps, where with the BER data, we specifically targeted homes most recently who are in that bracket where heat pumps make sense for their home. And we did it in 4 different ways with 4 different types of language. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just the euro that motivated people to do it. In some cases, the difference in language saying, you have been selected, made the difference. And in other cases, it was subtle twists around carbon and that. And this is very important, because as we look to aggregate and build volume, we need to understand how to communicate best to people in rural or peri-urban or urban environments. We need to understand how to communicate to ABC1 market demographics instead of people in the lower end. We have great experience, frankly, in communicating with the can-pay people, and also communicating with those who are technically within that fuel-poor environment and who can qualify for it. There is a large cohort in the middle who find themselves unable to part finance.
Yeah.
And we all understand that challenge, we all recognise that challenge. I think that is where some of this volume will have to carry through. So again, it's how you give someone the ability to make that choice by helping them out with finance, and then separately making them want to do it. So yes is the answer. I think the evidence is there that some of this is working. In 2016 we had a budget, I think, of 75 odd million. This year it's about 150 odd million, slightly greater than that. And appetite is outstripping what we have there across our programmes. So
in terms of the numbers who make initial contact but for whatever reason aren't able to proceed to securing a grant,
yeah.
Can you tell us how many of them there are? Do you have an analysis of what it is that prevents them from going through?
So, off the top of my head, absolutely not, but
okay.
Yes, because that is what we've been looking into. So we're more than happy to collate some of that information, share it, no problem.
Any further questions? Sean?
Sorry, just there were some further questions you had. So I think probably the next question you had was, what are we doing in going forward to further reduce the impact of fossil fuel boilers in new dwellings? So I think even though we've made good progress in phasing out oil boilers and solid fuel appliances in new dwellings, I think we're still continuing to advance the performance requirements of the building regulations. So in the current revision of the building regulations, which takes effect on the 1st of November of this year, the performance requirement is going to be advanced to be 70% better than the 2005 dwelling. So that will further drive renewables and efficient heating systems in new dwellings. But I think another important element of the new regulations is that we've introduced the renewable energy ratio. So previously, the renewables requirement was based on an absolute value. We're changing that to a ratio which facilitates further the installation of renewables, and we'll see a further increase in renewables. And actually, in the graph that SEAI showed earlier on, you can actually see increases in renewables as the calculation methodology becomes more refined. So the introduction of the renewable energy ratio will also facilitate greater penetration of renewables. At the moment, the CSO data shows that the rate of increase of renewables is 4% per annum. So their figures show 38% heat pumps in the current mix. That's increasing at a rate of 4% per annum. You know, I think we can conservatively say that will continue, but with the new performance requirements, it's actually likely to increase. In addition to advancing the performance requirements, we're also working with our colleagues in SEAI and Climate Action, but also in DEBI and Department of Education to build the supply chain. We've had some meetings recently with the National Standards Authority of Ireland, and a proposal has been developed for the NSAI board to develop a heat pump standard. That will involve extensive consultation with the industry and a review of the technical detail, and that kind of consultative process with the industry developing information will further advance the penetration of renewables in new buildings, and of course training will also advance the penetration of renewables. Another part of your question was well, I think there was a particular focus on multi-unit apartments. So in the current version of the TGD, the support technical guidance document to support the building regulations, previously there was only one example of a semi-detached dwelling and how to comply with that dwelling. In the new TGD, which will be published in the coming weeks, and has been published for public consultation for the last 18 months, we have apartment examples. We have apartment examples shown in that dwellings in that document, and we have apartment examples with renewables showing in that document. So we're providing detailed guidance on how to achieve the performance requirements. There was another question about when the gas boilers fail or have to be upgraded, maybe in you know, the life of a gas boiler is 20 years, so you know that would be the kind of time for
They have to be removed.
Or well, removed. But I think an important point is a typical dwelling built to the current regulations will produce about 800 kilograms of carbon per year. whereas a typical dwelling in the existing housing stock will produce about 5 kilotons of carbon per year. So whilst there is an opportunity to eliminate, to phase out fossil fuel boilers in new stock, the emissions achieved is much smaller than that would be achieved in the existing housing stock. And you know, as I said previously, gas boilers with PV have the same net emissions as a heat pump installed. So just we're providing, I suppose, just a point about the technical guidance document is we're providing more detailed information about how apartments can comply, and we're actually seeing a lot of heat pump proposals come through for apartments. And then with regards to the removal or replacement of gas boilers, I think an important point is that we've installed advanced insulation requirements in these new dwellings, and advancing the insulation is a good facilitator for the installation of heat pumps at a later stage. And then just you had one final question about solar panel exemptions. So I think maybe just the first point is to say that there is already an exemption there in planning regulations of up to, for solar panels, of up to 12 metres squared. So there is already, on dwellings, there is already an exemption there. But I think through the All of Government Action Plan, through the work we're doing on the All of Government Action Plan, I think there's a recognition that, you know, especially with the new grant scheme from SEAI, that 12 metres squared exemption limit needs to be increased. And the planning division in our department has recognised this and are planning to review that planning exemption by the end of this year.
A couple of minor questions, just because we will do a report in this area, and just around when we're moving to all the new technology around construction industry, albeit because of the lack of skilled trades that we do have here, the deficit that we're trying to build back upon. We've moved to a lot of off-site technology in order to offset the lag time that there is now currently in construction. What new technologies are we currently looking at within the department or within SEAI in order to fast-track the construction of homes and commercial developments, and maybe to offset some of the labour that is required? And I think it's such a key point that you made about career pathways for people in this industry. If they know there is a certainty up to 2050 that there is a career pathway for them, that there's longevity in this industry and not the cyclical process that we've seen in the last couple of years, how do we market that in a proper manner, not just in Ireland but obviously outside of Ireland? And we've had a number of conversations around this with various stakeholders that have come before us, especially around the cost of construction. And we had a very interesting discussion around universal design, and that potentially would be about a 3% in additional cost, but that will be offset later on in that person's lifetime. When it comes to standard design, I know the department's doing a huge amount of work around standard design and construction, but when you actually go out on site, especially around social housing delivery, I'm seeing a lot of variance in that. And we're often criticised because of the four-stage process that there is within the department, but I think that is teasing through a lot of design that isn't required in housing that would cause additional cost in the outlay. But is there a need for a stove to be put into a house, even if it's a pellet stove? Is there a need to put a stove into a house that's A1 or A2 rating, or is that just vanity? And the reason I ask that, it's not the cost of the stove, it's the cost of the labour that's required, it's the cost of the chimney that goes in, it's the cost of what you're providing outside, whether that's a cold storage or wood pellet storage, whatever that may be. Is there a requirement for that? When it comes to the new technologies that we're looking at in building, I read an interesting article yesterday around solar panel windows. Is there any case studies where that's been used, especially around commercial development? And what other new technologies are coming down the line that we're not aware of? Every 5 years looking at regulations, is that too long? Should this be something that's done annually? And I know we need to give certainty in the construction industry, and we can't keep moving the goalposts, but this industry is moving so fast now. I'm just wondering, is every year more suitable? And when it comes to our counterparts, probably the UK being the closest, when it comes to the UK and the RHI scheme, when it comes to heat pumps, how do we benchmark off them on that? And then as somebody who was a converter to heat pumps and heat recovery systems a long time ago, there is an ongoing maintenance cost to that. When it goes wrong, it can be really expensive. And I say that as somebody who converted, completely believes in it. You know, there's no going back from that. But there is a maintenance cost to that. Have we an average of that? Sean, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So I suppose there's, to me, there's two aspects to the question. One is about new technologies. How are we encouraging new technologies? And then the other is about standard design and construction, and maybe rapid delivery and off-site construction, and how are we encouraging that? So I think maybe the rapid delivery question, I think the department has been involved in setting up frameworks, or has worked with the OGP and DCC in setting up a rapid delivery framework in January 2017. I think there was 12 rapid delivery providers appointed to that system. Also, there is one currently underway with DCC for multi-unit developments, and also there's plans for a further low-rise rapid delivery framework. I think we are seeing that the development of these frameworks are leading innovation in the industry. The applicants to the frameworks initially, rapid delivery systems tend to be innovative systems. They're not typical construction types, and they need certification, and they need to go through due process to make sure that they meet the 12 parts of the building regulations, in particular Part D, and that they're fit for their intended use. And as we put out the rapid delivery frameworks, we find that the suppliers are becoming more robust in their certification and are becoming more detailed in the way they present their tenders and their certification, and are improving the quality of the product that they're delivering. And also the provision of these rapid delivery frameworks are also giving the suppliers confidence to put in place supply systems to deliver rapid delivery frameworks. In the context of energy, off-site construction has many advantages, and it provides more precise tolerance. You can do more detailed work in the factory-type environment, and it's more repeatable as well. So with regards to the attention of detail, rapid delivery does support the nearly zero energy building agenda for new dwellings. In addition to that, the department is developing standard specifications for local authorities to provide, it's not standard specifications, standard guidelines to inform local authorities how they can standardise their designs, and they're due quite soon. So that's on the rapid delivery side. Some of that can be transferred into the retrofit area, and in the Netherlands there is an example of Energy Sprong, which is an off-site manufacturing system that you can apply where you have repeatable social housing that's of a poor quality. You develop a standardised design. It's manufactured in a factory, and then it's brought to a site, and it's implemented at scale and at lower cost. So there is an opportunity there to develop off-site in the retrofit area as well. And I think you were talking about career development. I think all that creates certainty and is very interesting for people who are interested to work in the construction sectors. I think the other question then is about new technologies coming down the road. Building integrated PV will be a new technology. We'll see it in glazing, we'll see it in roof tiles. As these products come onto the market and they become certified, we work with SEAI to incorporate them into our calculation methodologies, and we work very well. I think we work very quickly to adapt our calculation methodologies to introduce them. Exhaust air heat pumps is also a new technology that we're currently integrating into our calculator. Exhaust air heat pumps.
Sorry, yeah.
So they take the ventilation air and they recover the heat from it. I think at the moment the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive sets a 5-year timeline for the review of building regulations. I think to do it any more quickly than that would be too quick. Many developments take 1.5 years, 2 years to develop. So to start changing goalposts in the middle of those changes, in the middle of that design, is unfair and will cause problems for the construction industry. I think the important thing is that we keep advancing our performance requirements and set realistic but ambitious targets for the industry to achieve. So they have to be able to achieve them, but they have to be ambitious as well in order to meet our climate action goals. There was a question about stoves, and I think you were talking about social housing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the A2 rating.
Yeah, so, you know...
there's never a need really to turn to put on a stove, is there?
So we set the performance requirements. Typically, in most new houses and in private sector housing, we're seeing the designers and the developers choose to install a heat, as was shown in the slide, a heat pump or a gas boiler with photovoltaics as the main heating system, and that will meet the heating needs of the dwelling. And then there was a question about UK heat pumps and maintenance.
It comes down to really the grants, I think, with the SEAI. That
Okay.
one. Yeah.
And just as regards the costs of maintenance, when we do our cost optimal calculations, it's a 30-year life cycle cost, and heat pumps in those calculations have a life cycle of 15 years, so the full replacement of the heat pump is built.
That depends on how well they're used, though, doesn't it? That can be reduced dramatically on the amount that you're using.
But standardised maintenance costs and replacement costs are built into the life cycle.
Is it anywhere between 7 and 15?
15 is the standardised value, but I think possibly related to your point is if there's a poor design or if they're designed not to meet the correct capacity of the dwelling, this can have an effect on their life cycle. And again, that's why standards, capacity building and training are so important for the introduction of new technologies.
Thanks, Sean.
I'll just pick up on what John hasn't mentioned. I would agree with him regarding modular off-site building, some of the technologies coming towards this area that we have significant interest in, because if you can improve consistency of build and quality of that consistency, I think it's quite important. In terms of building integrated PV, we supported recently through our research development and demonstration programme a number of projects on that and across different building technologies that are coming our way. So what I might do is, again, in follow-up, list out some of those and provide accessible links for the group here who might be interested in that. In terms of confidence in the supply chain, I think it comes from the government not only setting out an ambition, which is right now 2030 and 2050, and also then articulating what level we need the supply chain to respond to, but also putting in place some of those facilitators. So a supply chain will know that not many of their clients can afford to do that right now. The supply chain will know that there aren't that many of them around working on it right now. And I think something that's not considered terribly well is the value chain, where the homeowner has to make a decision to do something. The contractor has to make a decision to do something. The architect or engineer has to make a decision to do something, and they all need to make that decision instead of doing something else. So if right now there's more profit margin to be taken from new build, it is natural that people would tend towards that activity than another. So again, this is why I think we need to increase some activity in retrofit, but prepare for that opportunity that will come, and push a little harder in that direction and lean into an economic challenge this time around. I think there was an interesting dialogue earlier on how we could see a 70% 2030 target interacting with heat pumps. I just think it's worth noting that there are two types of challenge that come up. One is the daily challenge, where the wind will blow for 6 hours and won't blow, and heat pumps and smart meters and electric vehicles can help us with that. But there's also a seasonal challenge, where our heating season is really 4, 6, 7, 8 months and changing thanks to climate change. But in those summer months, you do not have that need for heat. So its ability to serve that responsiveness declines. So I think there's two things we just need to keep in mind. There's the instantaneous response, and then there's the long-term seasonal piece where you just have a heating season of a certain length. And I think that that's the final point.
UK.
Oh, absolutely, apologies. So the first phase of the Renewable Heat Incentive in Ireland, called the Support Scheme for Renewable Heat, the SSRH, commenced last year for heat pumps only in the commercial sector and not for people in large industry who are already dealt with in the emissions trading scheme. So it's that cohort that aren't already forced to do something and that aren't incentivised to do something at the other end. And then separately, very recently, state aid approval was provided, and the support scheme for renewable heat that looks at biomass and other aspects will come through. It was determined to use a capital grant for heat pumps because the challenge with heat pumps is an upfront cost, as distinct from supporting the type of biomass fuel that will come over 10 or 15 years. And this was down to extensive analysis, economic and otherwise, and supply chain analysis of what Ireland could be hoped to pursue. I think I would note that we had excellent communication and frequent communication, including a number of visits with Ofgem in the UK and our peers up in Scotland and Northern Ireland, to ensure that economically the best value for money would be achieved while incentivising the activity we wanted. And in fact, Ofgem in the UK are now looking at some of the mechanisms put in place at the Irish SSRH to see can they bring them back to their own scheme. So we're quite comfortable that we're benchmarking well, but we won't know until 1 or 2 or 3 years hence as to where the economic activity came in. And separately, part of what we need to do is to admit to ourselves that you can't anticipate how a value chain will respond to an incentive. So you might need to change it and tweak it, and that is natural. And if you look at any economic incentive of any species, that is how you approach it. You respond to what the market tells you and you ensure value for money. I think that was the final point.
Thanks,
Apologies, Chair.
Owen?
Yes, just three final questions. Just to go back to the solar planning regulations. As you know, the problem is certain categories of buildings aren't included in the exemptions, like schools, for example, but also the sizes that are exempt were built for older technologies, and therefore for the PVs, they're causing particular problems. I know the department is limited in staff, and I know there's a million other things going on in the department, but when I hear there's a review to be concluded by the end of the year, it does make me nervous, because what that really means is it's more likely that nothing is going to change until next year, the year after. That's not a criticism. Is this such a complicated thing that it needs a significant review, or is it not just a matter of trying to update the regulations? I mean, the idea, for example, that you couldn't have the exemptions to apply to schools now, right? Given the fact that we have a major school building programme, it just seems to me something surely that could have a little level of urgency. That's the first question. In relation to the gas boilers, so if I understood it right, you were saying that the kind of net emissions reduction for a solar and gas versus a heat pump is about the same, right? But does that include the embedded carbon emissions from the extraction of the gas and the transportation of the gas? I presume it doesn't. If it does, just let me know, but it just seems to me that if part of what we're trying to do is reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, then rather than the hesitancy that I detected in your response, which was, not necessarily that there's an objective that eventually these things will either not exist or only exist in very, very small numbers, it seemed to be suggesting that actually, no, it's okay if we have 50% of our new dwellings continuing to use fossil fuels, albeit at maybe a reduced level, particularly when we're talking about expanding the level of overall house construction. So if you could just kind of talk me through that a little bit more. And then finally, in terms of the technical guidance documents, my specific question, I suppose, was if we're providing technical guidance documents for multi-unit developments now, and if they are installing gas heaters, for example, gas boilers, and if at a point in time that building has to be retrofitted to replace the gas with something else, surely there are elements of the technical guidance that can be put in place now that makes it easier or reduces the cost of that retrofit if and when it happens in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time. Is that something you're working into those technical guidance documents? Is it something you're discussing or thinking about? And if not, should it not be? Because it is quite likely that in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time, there'll be people in this Oireachtas talking to yourselves, your successors, asking themselves, where are we going to get the money to replace all these gas boilers with something else? And if we make it as easy as possible now in terms of that change, surely that would be a good kind of forward planning.
Okay. So just, sorry, I got the question on urgency, embedded carbon and the technical guidance, but there was another question you said about...
the solar planning regs.
No, the future fossil fuels. So we had 50% of the dwellings.
Yeah, no, it's just, I suppose, it's related just to that the issue of the gas boilers, that you know, your choice of words wasn't that we will eventually have to replace the majority of these. It's the life cycle when they have to be repaired, or, I mean, is it the department's view and the government's view that we can continue to have a very large volume of houses that have gas boilers indefinitely into the future? Or is it the view that at some point that's going to have to be phased out? Okay. And how is that going to be achieved? And the connected question is, surely then could the technical guidance documents, particularly for the multi-units, make that as easy as possible? So even if we can't get rid of them now, because there's lack of capacity and all the rest of it, at the point at which those buildings will have to be retrofitted, design solutions could be put in place now to make it much easier to transition to a district heating system, for example, or something else.
Okay. So I think, first of all, on the urgency, on the review of the planning exemptions, what I'd say is that the Planning Division recognises that it's important to do this. They have included it in their business plan. It is a review of an SI. There is a process involved in that, and there is an urgency around it, but the timeline that they have for it is by the end of this year, which, for legislation is reasonably quick, Embodied carbon emissions for gas, so certainly in the primary energy factor for gas, the extraction cost is included in the primary energy factor. With regards to technical guidance documents, I think that's the same question as the gas boilers. So, the building regulations set the performance requirements as they are at the time. It's a matter for the designer to specify how they comply at the time of the building regulations. There are several solutions. I think you asked this question initially in the context of district heating. District heating is a developing technology in Ireland. There are supports for it being put in place. It could become more widespread, but right now it's hard to forecast exactly what the technologies will be in different places in 20 years' time, or 10 or 50. This is changing very quickly. So I think what we're doing is we're advancing the fabric performance that makes the dwelling suitable for low carbon technologies. As regards preparing for other technologies that may be available in the future, that's quite difficult to predict. So the requirement is that the designer complies with the current performance requirements.
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah.
Further questions, Helen? No. Can I thank our witnesses for today? I think we could spend days at this, and I look forward to further documentation coming our way. Apologies there wasn't a bigger turnout. I think it's just the time of year it is, but they can watch back on the meeting as well. But can I thank you very much, and apologies for delaying you. We kept you over an hour extra. So this meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held Wednesday the 29th, and that's our quarterly update on rebuilding Ireland and short-term lettings. Thank you all.